Stop looking. Take it off. The words tore from Lena Whitmore's cracked lips as the desert sun carved fire into her skin. Bound to that fence post in Dust Hollow, 1884, she was a woman stripped of dignity, but not spirit-accused, abandoned, left to burn. The town watched her shame. One man rode toward her salvation. This is the story of mercy given twice, justice claimed in gunfire, and two broken souls who learned that redemption doesn't arrive on white horses, it crawls through the dust on bleeding knees. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lena's story travels across this world. The sun didn't just shine over Dust Hollow that July afternoon, it punished. It beat down on the cracked earth with the kind of relentless fury that made men question God and women question why they'd ever left the shade of civilization. The town itself sat like a collection of broken teeth along the edge of the Sonoran Flats buildings, weathered gray and splintered by wind that carried nothing but grit and the distant promise of storms that never came. On the eastern edge of town, where Eldon Grady's sprawling ranch bled into the wild country beyond, a woman hung bound to a fence post like something meant to be forgotten. Lena Whitmore. 26 years old, though the last 3 had aged her in ways that couldn't be measured in time alone. Her dark hair, normally tied back in a practical braid, hung loose and tangled around a face gone red from sun and exertion. Her wrists were lashed to the post with rope that had already worn through the first layer of skin, leaving raw, weeping burns that stung with every involuntary movement. Her shirt, once a simple cottonwork blouse, was soaked through with sweat clinging to her back and shoulders. Her boots had been taken. Her feet bare against the scorched earth had stopped feeling the burn an hour ago. She'd been there since dawn. The crowd that had gathered to watch her humiliation had thinned as the day wore on. Shame was entertaining for only so long before it became uncomfortable, and the good people of Dust Hollow preferred their cruelty at a distance. A few stragglers remained ranch hands who worked for Eldon townspeople too curious or too callous to look away, and a handful of children who didn't understand what they were witnessing but knew instinctively that something terrible was happening. Lena's eyes, when they managed to focus, fixed on the man responsible for all of this. Eldon Grady stood 20 feet away in the shade of his ranch house porch, a tin cup of cool water in one hand and a satisfied smirk on his weathered face. He was a bull of a man, 52 years old, shoulders broad as a barn door, hands scarred from decades of breaking horses and breaking men who opposed him. He wore his wealth casually tailored vest over a pressed shirt. Boots polished to a mirror shine a silver watch chain glinting at his waist. His hat, a pristine Stetson, sat tilted back on his head, revealing a face that sun and sin had carved into something hard and unforgiving. "How we doing out there, Miss Whitmore?" he called, voice carrying across the yard with mock concern, feeling repentant, yet ready to tell me where you hid my horse. Lena's lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Her throat was sandpaper tongue swollen. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was a ruined rasp. "Didn't take your damn horse." Eldon laughed, a deep rolling sound that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. He took a long, deliberate drink from his cup, letting water dribble down his chin before wiping it away with the back of his hand. "That's so funny thing, though. My stallion, worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes, disappears the same night you're seen near the stable. You're telling me that's coincidence?" "I was checking on the mare with colic." Lena managed each word an act of defiance that cost her. "Like you told me to. Told you to check on her. Didn't tell you to steal my best breeding stock and try to sell him in Yuma. Never went to Yuma. Never took nothing." Eldon's smile faded. He set down his cup with deliberate care and stepped off the porch boots, crunching against the hard-packed dirt as he approached. The crowd instinctively gave him space. Even the boldest among them knew better than to stand between Eldon Grady and something he wanted to hurt. He stopped inches from Lena, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath, the expensive soap he used, the underlying scent of leather and horse and old sweat that clung to every rancher west of the Mississippi. "You know what I think," he said quietly, voice dropping to a register that somehow carried more menace than his shouts. "I think you're a liar and a thief, just like your daddy was. I think you've been stealing from me since the day I was fool enough to hire you out of pity. I think you saw an opportunity to take something valuable, and you took it because that's what Whitmores do." Lena gathered what moisture remained in her mouth and spat directly at his boots. The glob of saliva, pink-tinged with blood from her cracked lips, landed on the polished leather with an audible splat. For a moment, the entire yard went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Eldon moved. His hand came up fast, not a slap, but a backhanded strike with the full weight of his fury behind it. The impact snapped Lena's head to the side, sending a spray of blood from her split lip. Pain exploded across her cheek and jaw, bright and immediate. Her vision went white, then dark, then slowly agonizingly returned. She tasted copper, felt warmth trickling down her chin. And she laughed. It was a broken, awful sound, half sob, half genuine mirth, but it made Eldon take a step back like she'd pulled a knife. "That all you got?" she whispered, blood stringing between her teeth. "Your daddy hit harder, and he was half your size." For a moment, she thought he might kill her right there. His hand went to the gun at his hip, fingers curling around the grip with white-knuckled intensity. She saw murder in his eyes, saw him calculating whether the satisfaction would be worth the questions. Then he forced his hand to relax, forced the smile back onto his face. "Nah," he said, voice carefully controlled. "Nah, Miss Whitmore, I ain't gonna give you that mercy. You're gonna stay out here until the sun does what the sun does. And when you're ready to tell me the truth, when that pride of yours finally cracks, maybe then we'll talk about water, about shade, about what happens next." He turned to the crowd, raising his voice to address them all. "Let this be a lesson, folks. This is what happens when you steal from Eldon Grady. This is what happens when you think you're clever enough to play me for a fool. She hangs there until she confesses or until the desert takes her. Either way, justice gets served." With that, he walked back to his porch, retrieved his water, and disappeared into the cool shadows of his house. The crowd began to disperse. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious an act of cowardice, but in ones and twos finding reasons to be elsewhere, work to return to, errands to run. Anything to avoid looking at the woman tied to that post, anything to avoid the uncomfortable weight of their own complicity. Within 20 minutes, the yard was empty except for one ranch hand, a kid no more than 19 named Tom Jessup, who'd been stationed to watch Lena and make sure she didn't somehow escape. Tom stood in the shade of the barn, arms crossed, looking everywhere but directly at her. "Boy," Lena called out, voice barely carrying the distance. "Boy, please." Tom flinched but didn't turn toward her. "I didn't take his horse. I swear it. I swear on my father's grave." "Don't talk to me," Tom said quietly. "Mr. Grady said nobody talks to you." "Just water, please. I said don't talk to me." Lena let her head fall forward, chin against her chest. The sun continued its merciless arc across the sky. Her shadow, which had stretched long and protective in the early morning, had shrunk to almost nothing beneath her. There was no escape from the heat, no reprieve, just the endless crushing weight of it pressing down on her skull, leaching moisture from her body, cooking her from the outside in. She thought about her father. Marcus Whitmore had been a good man, flawed, certainly prone to drink and poor decisions, but fundamentally good. He'd raised Lena alone after her mother died, birthing her working odd jobs across 3 territories, teaching her to ride to shoot, to read to question authority, even when it would have been easier not to. 10 years ago, he'd been accused of rustling cattle from a ranch up in New Mexico. The evidence was circumstantial. He'd been in the area, he'd been desperate for money, and someone had seen a man matching his description near the herd the night before they disappeared. He'd been sentenced to hang. Lena, only 16 at the time, had begged everyone who would listen, had pleaded with the judge, the sheriff, the rancher who'd lost the cattle. But justice in the territories moved fast and cared little for the tears of teenage girls. Then on the day of the execution, something unexpected happened. The marshal overseeing the hanging, a man named Silas Boone, had stopped it. He'd ridden into town that morning with a prisoner he'd captured, a known cattle thief who'd confessed to the New Mexico job among a dozen others. Marcus Whitmore was innocent. The real rustler was already in irons. They'd cut her father down from the scaffold with the noose already around his neck. It should have been a moment of pure joy, of miraculous salvation. Instead, it became something more complicated. Because while Marcus was legally cleared, the stain of accusation never fully washed away. The rancher who'd accused him felt humiliated by the mistake and made sure everyone knew that where there's smoke, there's fire. Other ranchers became wary of hiring Marcus Whitmore if one man had suspected him. Maybe there was something to suspect. The jobs dried up. The money disappeared. Marcus started drinking more, working less, sinking into a bitterness that rotted him from the inside. Within 3 years, he was dead, thrown from a horse he was too drunk to ride properly. Neck broken on impact with the ground. Lena had blamed the accusation. Had blamed the rancher who'd made it. Had blamed the system that ruined a man's life, even in the act of saving it. And she'd blamed Marshal Silas Boone, too, in the irrational way that grief sometimes demands a target. If he'd ridden in one day earlier, maybe none of the stain would have stuck. If he'd been more convincing in his testimony about Marcus's innocence, maybe the whispers would have stopped. If. She'd seen him once more after that 3 years later, when she was 19 and working at a saloon in Tucson. He'd walked in for a drink, older and wearier, no longer wearing a badge. Their eyes had met across the room. He'd nodded a small gesture of recognition, or perhaps apology. She turned her back and walked away. That was 7 years ago. She hadn't thought about Silas Boone in years, until today. Because as the sun reached its apex and Lena felt herself sliding toward unconsciousness, as her body began the process of shutting down non-essential functions to conserve what little water remained in her system, as Tom Jessup looked nervously toward the house, wondering if Mr. Grady would be angry if the girl died before she confessed. A sound carried across the desert. Hoofbeats. Tom heard it first, straightening from his slouch against the barn. He shaded his eyes, squinting toward the eastern ridge, where heat shimmer made the landscape dance and waver, like something viewed underwater. A rider. Single horse moving at a steady trot, too deliberate to be someone lost, too confident to be someone afraid. Lena heard it too. The sound penetrated the fog of heat exhaustion and pain, pulling her back from the edge of darkness. She forced her head up, forced her eyes to focus on the approaching figure. Even at this distance, even through the distortion of heat and dying hope, something about the rider's silhouette struck her as familiar. The way he sat, the horse relaxed but attentive, like a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. The angle of his hat, the rifle scabbard visible on his left side. The horse itself a roan mare, distinctive in coloring, the kind of mount a man chose for stamina rather than flash. The rider crested the ridge and began his descent toward the ranch. As he drew closer, details emerged: a man in his 50s, weather-beaten and trail-worn, wearing a duster that had seen better decades and a shirt that might once have been white. His face was half hidden by his hat brim, but what was visible showed hard miles and harder choices. Tom Jessup's hand had drifted to his own gun, not drawing it, but ready. The rider came to a stop 30 feet from the fence post, sitting easy in his saddle as his eyes took in the scene. Lena bound and burning. Tom young and nervous. The empty yard and the house beyond where Eldon Grady undoubtedly watched from a window. When the man finally spoke, his voice was like gravel rolling down a canyon wall, rough from disuse but carrying clear across the distance. "That's a hell of a way to treat your help." Tom squared his shoulders, trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. "This ain't your business, mister. Best keep riding." The man didn't move. His eyes, gray as storm clouds set in a face carved by sun and sorrow, remained fixed on Lena. "Looks like my business if I choose to make it so," he said quietly. "Mr. Grady will. Eldon Grady can come tell me himself if he's got objections." Something in the way he said Eldon's name with familiarity rather than deference made Tom hesitate. This wasn't some drifter who could be scared off with a hard look and a hand on a gun. This was someone who'd seen violence up close and come out the other side. Lena stared at the rider, her mind struggling to connect dots through the haze of heat and pain. That voice, that bearing, the way he sat his horse like a man who'd spent years enforcing laws in places where law was barely more than a suggestion. "Silas?" She croaked the name, scraping out of her like something long buried finally breaking the surface. The rider's eyes shifted to her face. Something flickered there, recognition, surprise, maybe regret. "Miss Whitmore." He said the words carrying a weight of history that Tom Jessup couldn't begin to understand. Silas Boone dismounted in one smooth motion, boots hitting the ground with barely a sound despite his size. He was a big man, not as broad as Eldon Grady, but tall with the kind of wiry strength that came from hard living rather than comfortable ranching. His face, now that Lena could see it properly, bore scars she didn't remember, a line across his left cheek, another through his eyebrow. His hair, once dark, had gone steel gray, but his eyes were the same sharp, assessing, carrying, and intelligence that many men mistook for coldness until they realized it was actually the opposite, a deep, abiding awareness of human suffering that he tried very hard to prevent. "You need to step away from the lady," Tom said, hand now definitely on his gun grip, though he hadn't drawn. Silas ignored him. He walked toward Lena with the deliberate pace of a man who'd already calculated the odds and decided he could live with them. When he reached the fence post, he pulled a knife from his belt, a big practical blade designed for field work rather than fighting. "Don't!" Tom's gun cleared leather, now pointing at Silas's back. "I said don't!" Silas looked over his shoulder, and the expression on his face made Tom's finger hesitate on the trigger. "Boy," Silas said quietly, "you pull that trigger, and what happens next isn't going to end well for anyone, especially not for you. So I'm going to cut this lady down, and you're going to decide whether Eldon Grady's displeasure is worth dying over. He'll kill me if I let you. He'll kill you quicker if you shoot me, and it brings the law down on this place. Because that's exactly what'll happen." Silas turned back to lean a knife, rising to the rope. "Now you can make your choice, and I'll make mine." The blade bit into the rope with a sawing motion. Lena felt the pressure on her wrists ease fractionally. Tom's gun wavered. He was 19 years old, had never shot anyone, and was suddenly confronting the reality that the next 5 seconds would define the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. The gun lowered. Silas cut through the rope with 2 more strokes. Lena's arms dropped, and she would have collapsed if Silas hadn't been ready for it. He caught her taking her weight with a gentleness that contradicted his rough appearance, lowering her to the ground in the shadow of the fence post. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now. I've got you." Lena's lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came out except a whimper of pain as circulation returned to her hands and wrists, bringing with it a fresh wave of agony. Silas pulled a canteen from his belt and uncorked it one-handed. "Small sips. Don't gulp or you'll be sick." He tilted water against her lips, and Lena drank with desperate gratitude, forcing herself to take the slow sips he advised, even though every instinct screamed to drain the entire container in one go. The water was warm, practically hot, but it was moisture, and that made it more precious than gold. After a few swallows, Silas pulled the canteen back despite her protest. "More in a minute. Let your body process that first." He shrugged out of his duster and draped it over her shoulders, creating a tent of shade that felt like salvation. Then he pulled a cloth from his pocket, wet it with canteen water, and began dabbing at her face, cleaning away the blood, the dust, the tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. "Why?" Lena whispered when she could form words again. Silas didn't look at her, focusing on his ministrations with professional detachment. "Why what? Why come back? Why? Care?" His hands paused for just a moment. When they resumed, his voice was carefully neutral. "Because I should have cared more the first time." Before Lena could ask what he meant, the ranch house door slammed open. Eldon Grady stood on his porch, and if he'd been angry before now, he was incandescent with rage. His face had gone, red veins standing out on his neck. His hand rested on his gun, not threatening yet, but promising. "Silas goddamn Boone," he said, voice carrying across the yard. "I should have known. Only man stupid enough to interfere in my business is one who's already ruined his own life." Silas stood slowly, positioning himself between Eldon and Lena. "Afternoon, Eldon. Been a while." "Not long enough. You got no authority here. No badge, no business, no goddamn reason to be on my land. Saw a woman tied to a fence post in the sun. Didn't need a badge to know that wasn't right. That woman is a thief and a liar, and she's getting exactly what she deserves." "Funny thing about that," Silas said conversationally. "I was passing through Yuma 4 days ago. Mentioned I was heading this direction, and a horse trader there told me an interesting story. Said someone tried to sell him a stallion matching the description of your missing horse. Said the seller was a big man, maybe 40, with a scar on his hand shaped like a crescent moon. Eldon's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. That's a real specific description, Silas continued. And it made me curious because I know your foreman, Pete Hartley, has a scar just like that. Got it in a knife fight in El Paso back in '79. Distinctive mark. You calling my foreman a thief? I'm saying maybe you ought to ask him some questions before you cook a woman alive over accusations. Pete Hartley has been with me for 8 years. He's loyal enough to steal from you and let someone else take the blame. That's a different kind of loyalty, Eldon. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the yard. Years of history passed between them, unspoken but felt. They'd known each other in better days when Silas wore a badge and Eldon's ambitions were smaller and more honest. They'd respected each other once in the grudging way that lawmen and powerful ranchers often did. That respect had curdled into something more complicated over the years. Even if that's true, Eldon said finally, voice tight, you still got no right to cut her down. That was my call to make. And you made the wrong one. This is my land. And she's a human being. Silas's voice rose for the first time, carrying real heat. You don't get to torture people just because you own the dirt under their feet. That ain't law. That ain't justice. That's just cruelty for its own sake. Eldon came down off the porch, moving with deliberate menace. Several ranch hands appeared from various buildings, drawn by the confrontation, armed and watchful. You're going to lecture me about justice, Eldon said, voice dropping back to dangerous quiet. You, the man who let Marcus Whitmore walk free and then watched him drink himself to death, the man who turned in his badge because he couldn't stomach the consequences of his own choices. Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. You want her back on that post, he said evenly. You're going to have to go through me. That's not the threat you think it is, old man. Maybe not. But you shoot me over this, you're going to have to explain to the territorial marshal why you killed a former lawman over a horse thief you can't prove existed. And given that your foreman has suddenly decided to take an extended trip to Mexico, checked with Tom here before I rode in, and Pete left this morning real sudden, well, that's going to raise some interesting questions. It was a bluff, and both men knew it. But it was a good bluff wrapped in enough truth to make it dangerous to call. Eldon's hand flexed on his gun grip. For 5 long seconds, the entire yard held its breath, waiting to see if this would end in gunfire. Then Eldon smiled, a cold, calculated expression that held no humor. Fine, he said. Take her. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway. But Silas, you and me were going to settle accounts someday. You keep interfering in my business, and someday real soon I'm going to decide the cost is worth it. I'll be ready when you do. Eldon turned and walked back into his house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The ranch hands dispersed slowly, reluctantly, like dogs called off from a fight they wanted to finish. Tom Jessup stood frozen, gun still in his hand, looking lost. Silas walked back to Lena and crouched beside her. Can you ride? I think so. Good, because we need to be gone from here before Eldon changes his mind or works up his courage with a bottle. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight, when her legs threatened to buckle. Together they made their way to his horse. Silas mounted first, then pulled Lena up behind him, with surprising ease for a man his age. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid reality of him, muscle and bone, and the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. The duster still draped over her shoulders. Her bare feet found purchase against his stirrups. Where are we going? She whispered against his back. Anywhere but here, he said, and urged the horse into motion. They rode east toward the rising mountains, toward the coming night, toward whatever came next. Behind them, Dust Hollow and Eldon Grady's ranch receded into the shimmering heat, becoming smaller and smaller until finally disappearing entirely into the vast indifference of the desert. Lena closed her eyes and let herself lean into Silas's back. Let herself be carried. Let herself just for a moment stop fighting the world. She thought about mercy given twice. She thought about her father's face when they'd cut him down from that scaffold. She thought about the long, strange road that had brought her here to this moment, rescued by a man who'd saved her family once before. And she thought about what Silas had said, "Because I should have cared more the first time." What did that mean? What debt did he think he owed the Whitmores? And why, after all these years, had he chosen this moment to pay it? The questions swirled through her heat-addled mind, but answers remained elusive. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the warmth of Silas's body in front of her, the exhaustion of her ordeal, all of it conspired to pull her toward unconsciousness. Just before she slipped under, she heard Silas speak so quietly she couldn't be sure if it was real or imagined. "I won't fail another Whitmore. Not this time. Not ever again." Then darkness took her, and she knew nothing more. The sun continued its westward journey across the sky. In Dust Hollow, Eldon Grady poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and began planning his revenge. Tom Jessup packed his belongings and decided tonight was the night he'd finally leave ranch work behind. And on the Eastern Trail, a former marshal carried a woman who'd become the embodiment of his regrets, riding toward an uncertain future with the certain knowledge that the past was never quite finished with any of them. This was the West, beautiful and brutal, unforgiving, and occasionally miraculously gracious enough to offer second chances to those brave or foolish enough to seize them. The story of Silas Boone and Lena Whitmore had only just begun. The horse's steady rhythm carried them through the afternoon heat and into the gentler embrace of evening. Lena drifted in and out of consciousness, her body demanding rest that her mind kept trying to deny. Each time she surfaced, she found herself still pressed against Silas's back, still moving forward, still safe in a way that felt foreign after so many hours of helplessness. When she finally opened her eyes and kept them open, the landscape had transformed. They'd climbed out of the desert flats into foothills dotted with juniper and scrub oak. The air had cooled considerably, carrying the pine-sharp scent of higher elevations. Shadows stretched long and purple across the trail, and the sky had begun its slow transition from burning blue to the softer shades of approaching dusk. "You back with me?" Silas asked, without turning around, somehow sensing the change in her breathing. "Yeah." Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, though it still carried the rasp of thirst and damage. "Where are we?" "About 8 miles east of Grady's Spread. There's a line shack another 2 miles up. Belongs to a rancher named McCall. Decent man, doesn't ask too many questions. We can rest there tonight." Lena's arms tightened around his waist as a particularly rough section of trail jostled them. "Won't he mind us using his property? McCall owes me a favor from back when I wore a badge. Stopped his youngest son from getting hanged for something he didn't do." Silas paused, then added quietly, "Seems to be a pattern with me." The bitterness in those last words made Lena study the back of his head more carefully. Gray hair curled over his collar longer than a lawman would typically wear it. His shoulders carried a tension that spoke of old injuries and older regrets. "You blame yourself," she said, "for what happened to my father." "Should I not?" "You saved his life." Did I?" Silas guided the horse around a fallen log, his movements automatic and sure. "Because from where I'm sitting, I delayed his death by 3 years, and made sure those years were filled with shame and suspicion and the kind of slow poison that eats a man from the inside. Some mercy that turned out to be." Lena rested her forehead against his back, feeling the heat of him through the sweat-damp shirt. He made his own choices. The drinking, the bitterness. That was on him, not you. Maybe. But I gave testimony about his innocence with all the conviction of a man who'd memorized it the night before. I presented the real rustler like it was some kind of miracle instead of basic goddamn police work that should have been done before they put a noose around an innocent man's neck. I did the bare minimum to clear his name, and then I rode out of town feeling satisfied with myself, never once thinking about what happens to a man after he's been publicly accused and publicly cleared, but never publicly believed. The horse climbed steadily, breathing hard, but maintaining its pace. "Good stock," Lena noted distantly. "The kind of mount that wouldn't quit on you when things got difficult." "So you've been carrying that guilt for 10 years, she asked, "among other things. And when you saw me tied to that post?" "I saw another chance to fail a Whitmore, and I decided I'd had enough of that particular tradition. Lena closed her eyes again, but this time not from exhaustion. She was trying to organize thoughts that kept slipping away like water through her fingers. You didn't have to come back. You could have just kept writing. Hell, you probably should have kept writing. Eldon Grady doesn't make empty threats. No, he doesn't. So why risk it? Why risk everything for someone you barely know, someone whose father you think you failed? Silas was quiet for so long that Lena thought he might not answer. The horse's hooves against stone, the creak of leather, the distant call of a hawk riding thermal currents. These became the only sounds in the world. Then, because I'm tired, Miss Whitmore. Bone tired and soul tired and tired of waking up every morning with the taste of regret in my mouth. And I figured maybe, just maybe, if I did something right for once, something that actually mattered, I might be able to look at myself in the mirror without wanting to put a bullet through the reflection. The rawness in his voice startled her. This wasn't the hard, controlled lawman who'd faced down Eldon Grady with casual authority. This was something more vulnerable, more human, more damaged. That's a lot of weight to put on one act of decency, she said softly. Maybe, but it's the only weight I've got left to carry. They rode on in silence after that, climbing higher into the hills as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and gold and deep bleeding red. Lena found herself thinking about weight, about the burdens people carried that nobody else could see. Her father had carried the weight of false accusation until it crushed him. She'd carried the weight of watching him die slowly, unable to help. And Silas. Silas carried the weight of every life he'd saved that ended badly anyway, every good intention that paved a road to hell. The line shack appeared just as full darkness threatened to fall. It was a small structure, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, built from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud and moss. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but looked sound enough to keep out weather. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a creek ran close enough that Lena could hear its gentle music even from a distance. Silas dismounted first, then helped Lena down with careful hands. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched ground muscles seized up from hours in the saddle after her ordeal. He caught her weight easily, holding her steady until her legs remembered how to bear weight. Easy. Give yourself a minute. Lena clung to his arms, hating the weakness but unable to deny it. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scars she'd noticed earlier, the way gray stubble shadowed his jaw. He smelled like horse and trail dust, an old leather familiar sense that somehow made her feel safer than she had any right to feel. I can stand, she said, after a moment, though she made no move to let go. I know you can, but there's no shame in needing help sometimes. Says the man who's been alone so long he's forgotten what help looks like. Silas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Fair point. He kept one hand on her elbow as he led her to the shack, testing the door and finding it unlocked. Inside the space was sparse but functional. A rope bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a potbelly stove with a stack of wood beside it. Someone, probably McCall, had left supplies, canned goods on a shelf, coffee and a tin blankets in a chest. Sit, Silas said, guiding Lena to one of the chairs. I'll get the horse settled, and then we'll see about getting some real food in you. He disappeared back outside, and Lena let herself slump in the chair, every muscle in her body screaming protest now that she'd stopped moving. Her wrists were a mess, raw and weeping, starting to crust over with blood and clear fluid. Her face felt swollen where Eldon had struck her. Her feet, bare and exposed, showed cuts and burns she didn't remember getting. She looked like hell and felt worse. Through the open door, she could see Silas moving with economical efficiency, unsaddling the horse, checking its legs and hooves, leading it to the creek for water. The way he moved spoke of decades of practice of a life lived mostly outdoors and mostly alone. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Everything he did had purpose. When he finally returned, he carried his saddlebags and bedroll plus a small medical kit that had seen considerable use judging by its worn leather exterior. Let me see your wrists, he said, setting everything down and pulling the other chair close to hers. Lena extended her arms, and Silas took them with surprising gentleness. His hands were scarred and calloused hard from work, but his touch was delicate as he examined the rope burns. These are going to hurt like hell for a few days. We need to clean them good, or they'll go septic. I figured. He opened the medical kit and pulled out a bottle of whiskey clean cloth strips and a small tin of what Lena assumed was some kind of salve. This first part's going to sting. Just do it. Silas poured whiskey over her wrists without warning, and Lena hissed through her teeth as liquid fire burned through damaged tissue. Her vision went white at the edges, and she had to consciously force herself not to jerk away. "Breathe," Silas murmured. "Just breathe through it." She did, dragging air into her lungs in ragged gasps while he worked. He was thorough but quick, cleaning both wrists, then dabbing them with the salve before wrapping them in clean cloth. The salve helped something cool and numbing that took the worst edge off the burning. "You've done this before," Lena said when she could speak without her voice shaking. "Too many times to count." Silas capped the whiskey and tucked it back into the kit. "Comes with the territory when you spend 20 years dragging criminals and fools across half the Southwest." "Is that why you quit? Got tired of patching up criminals and fools?" His hands paused in their work, and something dark passed across his face. "Among other reasons. You don't like talking about it." "No, I don't." "Why not?" Silas looked at her, then really looked at her, and Lena saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not anger, not resentment, just exhaustion so deep it went all the way down to bedrock. "Because some stories don't have good endings, Miss Whitmore, and some of us would rather forget we lived them at all." He stood abruptly, turning his attention to the stove. "I'm going to get a fire going. We've got beans and bacon in those supplies. Not fancy, but it'll put something in your stomach." Lena watched him move around the small space building a fire with the practiced ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. She wanted to press him, wanted to understand the man who'd saved her twice, removed once through her father, once directly, but something in his posture warned her off. Some wounds needed to be approached slowly, if at all. The fire caught and spread, filling the shack with warmth and flickering light. Silas set about preparing their meal, and Lena found herself drowsing in the chair, lulled by heat and safety, and the simple pleasure of watching someone care for her after a day spent believing she might die alone. "You should have let me burn," she said, suddenly the words escaping before she could stop them. Silas looked up from the pan where bacon was beginning to sizzle. "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm nobody. Because saving me put you in Eldon Grady's crosshairs. Because now you're stuck taking care of a woman who can barely walk and has nothing to offer you in return." "You think I pulled you off that post expecting something in return?" "I think everyone expects something, even if it's just the satisfaction of being a good person." Silas stirred the beans into the pan with the bacon, his movements methodical. "You're wrong about being nobody. Your father was a good man who got dealt a bad hand. You're his daughter, which means you matter. And as for Eldon, I was in his crosshairs long before today. This just made it official." "Why, what happened between you two?" "That's another story that doesn't have a good ending." "You've got a lot of those, don't you?" This time Silas did smile, a small, sad expression that held more pain than humor. "More than my share, yeah." He divided the food onto 2 tin plates and handed one to Lena, along with a spoon. The smell alone made her stomach cramp with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten, probably yesterday morning before everything went to hell. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the crackle of the fire. The food was simple but good, and Lena felt strength returning to her with each bite. By the time she'd cleaned her plate, she felt almost human again. "Thank you," she said quietly. Silas collected their plates and set them aside to be cleaned later. "Don't thank me yet. We've still got to figure out what comes next." "What do you mean?" "I mean you can't go back to Dust Hollow. Eldon might have let you go today, but that was pride talking, not sense. Once he's had time to stew on being defied in front of his men, he's going to want revenge, and you're the easiest target." Lena had been trying not to think about that particular reality. "So what are you suggesting I just run, leave everything behind?" "What everything you got?" "Family and Dust Hollow property. Anything tying you there besides bad memories and worse prospects." She wanted to argue, wanted to defend the life she'd built, however meager, but the truth was stark and unavoidable. She had nothing. No family, no property, no friends close enough to risk Eldon's wrath by harboring her. She'd been working for Eldon for 6 months, living in a bunkhouse with 2 other women who worked in his kitchen, saving money for what? Some vague dream of buying her own place someday. Getting out of the territories entirely. No, she admitted finally. Nothing worth dying for anyway. Then you've got choices. I know people in Silver City who might have work, or there's always California if you want to go farther. Point is, you can start over. Make something new. And what about you? Where do you fit in this plan? Silas leaned back in his chair, shadows playing across his face. I don't. I get you somewhere safe, make sure you're settled, and then I move on. Just like that. Your debt-paid conscience clear. Something like that. Lena studied him in the firelight, seeing past the hard exterior to the lonely man underneath. You know what? I think you're full of shit. That got his attention. His eyebrows rose. Excuse me. I think you've convinced yourself that you're some kind of broken thing that doesn't deserve connection or comfort. I think you've been alone so long you've forgotten there's any other way to be. And I think you pulled me off that post not because of my father, but because you saw in me the same thing you see in yourself, someone worth saving despite what the world says. Silas's jaw tightened. You don't know anything about me. I know you didn't have to clean my wounds with good whiskey instead of water. I know you gave me your duster when you could have just cut me free and ridden off. I know you're planning to escort me to safety instead of pointing me in the right direction and washing your hands of the whole mess. Those aren't the actions of a man who doesn't care. They're the actions of someone trying to make up for past mistakes. Maybe. Or maybe they're the actions of someone who still remembers how to be human, even if he's spent years trying to forget. Silas stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. He walked to the door and stood there silhouetted against the darkness outside. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. You should get some rest. Take the bed. I'll keep watch. Silas? Please, Miss Whitmore, just let it be. The exhaustion in those words stopped whatever Lena had been about to say. She recognized the sound of a man at the absolute end of his rope, barely holding himself together. Pushing him now would only make things worse. All right, she said quietly. But for what it's worth, I'm glad you were the one who found me today. Whatever you think about yourself, whatever mistakes you're carrying, you did right by me. And that matters. She stood testing her legs and finding them more stable than before. Moving to the bed, she lay down on top of the blanket, still wearing Silas's duster over her torn and filthy clothes. The rope frame creaked but held, and the mattress stuffed with straw, and probably home to various insects, felt like luxury after the day she'd endured. Sleep came faster than she'd expected, dragging her down into darkness before she could overthink the situation. Her last conscious thought was of Silas standing in that doorway, keeping watch over her like some kind of broken guardian angel who'd forgotten he had wings. Silas stayed at the door long after Lena's breathing had deepened into sleep. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the sky, with the kind of casual abundance that always made him feel simultaneously insignificant and privileged to witness. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness. The creek sang its endless song. The world continued turning indifferent to human drama. He thought about what Lena had said about being full of shit and forgetting how to be human. The words stung because they carried truth. He had been alone for years now, ever since he'd turned in his badge and walked away from everything he'd built. Ever since... But no. He wasn't going to think about that tonight. Wasn't going to revisit the memories that waited like landmines in his mind, ready to detonate if he stepped wrong. Instead, he thought about Marcus Whitmore, the man he'd saved and inadvertently destroyed. Marcus had been younger than Silas was now, maybe 42 or 43, with the kind of weathered good looks that came from outdoor work and simple living. He'd stood on that scaffold with a noose around his neck and tears streaming down his face, calling out for his daughter who stood weeping in the crowd below. Silas had ridden into town with the real rustler in irons, thinking he was delivering salvation, thinking he was fixing a terrible mistake before it became permanent. He testified with confidence, presented evidence, watched the judge order Marcus's immediate release, and then he'd ridden out of town satisfied with himself, believing he'd done something genuinely good. It wasn't until 3 years later, until he'd heard about Marcus's death through the grapevine that connected lawmen across territories, that he'd learned the truth. Learned that clearing a man's name legally didn't clear it socially. Learned that some stains never washed out, no matter how hard you scrubbed. By then, Silas had problems of his own, had made choices that cost him everything, had become the kind of man who understood far too late how easy it was to destroy lives with good intentions. He'd looked for Lena after Marcus died, thinking he should at least offer condolences, maybe some kind of explanation or apology. But she'd disappeared into the territories, moving from town to town, taking whatever work she could find. He'd catch word of her occasionally working a saloon in Tucson, cleaning houses in Prescott, breaking horses for a ranch in New Mexico. But by the time he'd get to wherever she'd been, she was always already gone. Until today. Until he'd ridden over that ridge and seen her tied to that post sun, cooking her alive, and something in his chest had cracked open like an egg. He'd known immediately who she was, despite the years and the circumstances. She had her father's eyes, her father's stubborn set to her jaw, and seeing her like that helpless suffering, abandoned by people who should have protected her, had brought every failure of his life crashing down on him at once. So he'd done the only thing he knew how to do, he'd interfered. And now here they were, a broken ex-lawman and the daughter of a man he'd failed hiding in a line shack in the middle of nowhere while a powerful rancher plotted revenge. Some people might call that progress. Silas called it Tuesday. He smiled grimly at his own dark humor and settled himself against the doorframe rifle across his knees. He wouldn't sleep tonight, couldn't afford to not with Eldon potentially sending men after them. So he'd keep watch, and he'd let Lena rest, and come morning, they'd figure out the next step. One day at a time. One choice at a time. It was the only way he knew how to live anymore. The hours passed slowly. Silas watched the stars wheel overhead, marking time by constellations he'd learned to read as a boy growing up on a ranch, not unlike Eldon's. Orion rose and climbed toward his apex. The Dipper pivoted around the North Star. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river of light. Somewhere around 3 a.m, Lena cried out in her sleep, a sharp, frightened sound that brought Silas to his feet, instantly rifle raised. But it was just a nightmare, her body thrashing under the blankets she'd pulled over herself at some point. He watched until she settled, murmuring something unintelligible, then returned to his vigil. He understood nightmares. He'd had enough of his own to fill several lifetimes. Dawn came gradually, the darkness bleeding away into shades of gray and then pink, and finally the clear, hard light of morning. Birds began their chorus. The world woke up around them, oblivious to the small human drama playing out in the line shack. Silas stood and stretched, feeling his back crack in several places. Getting old was hell on a body that had spent too many years sleeping rough and riding hard. He moved to the stove and got the fire going, again started coffee brewing from the supplies McCall had left. The smell woke Lena. She stirred, opened her eyes, and for a moment looked completely disoriented, probably trying to figure out where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then memory returned, and he watched the emotions play across her face, relief, followed by uncertainty, followed by determination. "Morning," he said quietly. "Coffee's almost ready." She sat up slowly, wincing at the movement. "What time is it?" "Little past 6. "Did you sleep at all?" "Didn't need to." Lena swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her feet against the floor. She looked rough, hair-tangled, clothes-stained face, still showing the marks of yesterday's violence, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Something harder, more resolved. "We need to talk about Eldon," she said. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "I figured we might." "He won't let this go. You know that, right? He can't afford to let people think he's weak, that he can be challenged. He'll come after us." "After you, maybe. I'm just the fool who got in his way." "Don't," Lena said sharply. "Don't minimize what you did. You made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the territory. For me. That means something." Silas sat down across from her, cradling his coffee cup in both hands. "It means I've got one more reason to avoid Dust Hollow for the rest of my life. Not much of a sacrifice, considering I wasn't planning to go back anyway." "And what about me?" "What's my plan?" "Run forever. Look over my shoulder, waiting for Eldon's men to show up." "You could." "I could, what? Start over, somewhere else, pretend none of this happened." She set her coffee down with enough force to slosh some over the rim. "I'm tired of running, Silas. I've been running since my father died, from town to town, job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to build something real. And now I'm supposed to run again because Eldon Grady decided to make me his scapegoat. What's the alternative? You can't go back. Can I? Lena stood pacing the small space despite the obvious pain in her feet. What if instead of running, we finished this? What if we found proof that Pete Hartley stole that horse? Cleared my name for real, not just in the eyes of one man, but officially. What if we made Eldon answer for what he did? Silas stared at her like she'd suggested they walk into the sun. That's suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way either of us stops carrying weight we don't deserve. She turned to face him fully, and there was fire in her eyes now, the same defiance he'd seen when she'd spat blood at Eldon's boots. You said you were tired of failing. Well, here's your chance to succeed. Help me prove my innocence. Help me make Eldon answer for leaving me to die. And maybe, just maybe, we both get to walk away from this thing with our heads held high. Silas wanted to say no. Wanted to tell her it was impossible, that going after a man like Eldon Grady required resources they didn't have and luck they'd already exhausted. Wanted to point out that even if they succeeded, there was no guarantee of justice in a territory where money and power spoke louder than truth. But looking at her face, at the determination burning there, at the refusal to be beaten, that had somehow survived despite everything, he found himself remembering who he used to be. He used to be the kind of man who didn't back down from fights just because they were hard. The kind of man who believed, however naively, that law and justice could actually mean something. The kind of man who'd ride 100 miles on a hunch because there was a chance, however slim, of saving an innocent life. That man had been buried under years of cynicism and failure and grief. But maybe, just maybe, there was still enough of him left to do this one last thing. You're asking me to help you wage war against Eldon Grady, Silas said slowly. I'm asking you to help me finish what you started 10 years ago. Help me prove that Whitmores aren't thieves, that we deserve better than the hand we've been dealt. You know the odds are terrible, right? I've beaten terrible odds before. And if we fail, if this gets us both killed? Lena smiled, then a fierce, reckless expression that reminded Silas painfully of her father. Then at least we'll fail doing something that matters. Silas drained his coffee in one long swallow, feeling it burn all the way down. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake with the kind of certainty that came from decades of making mistakes and recognizing their familiar shape. But Lena Whitmore was asking him to help her fight for her name, her dignity, her right to stand in the sun without shame. And after everything he'd done and failed to do, how could he possibly say no to that? All right, he heard himself say. All right, goddammit, we'll do it your way, but we do it smart and we do it careful. And if at any point I say we run, we run. Agreed. Lena's smile widened into something triumphant. Agreed. They shook hands on it, her bandaged palm against his scarred one, sealing a deal that would probably get them both killed. But as Silas felt the strength in her grip, saw the gratitude and determination in her eyes, he thought maybe dying for something worthwhile wouldn't be the worst way to go. He'd spent years dying slowly from the inside anyway. At least this way had purpose. So where do we start? Lena asked. Silas stood and moved to the window, looking out at the morning light painting the hills gold. We start by finding Pete Hartley before he disappears into Mexico for good. He's got answers we need, and I'd bet my last dollar he's got proof tucked away somewhere, insurance in case Eldon ever turned on him. We find that proof, and we've got leverage. And how do we find him? He could be anywhere by now. Could be. But men like Pete are creatures of habit. They've got places they go, people they trust. And I know most of them. Silas turned back to her, and for the first time since yesterday, he felt something like hope stirring in his chest. We'll need supplies, need to get you some boots and proper clothes, and we'll need to move fast before Eldon realizes what we're doing. Then let's move. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Silas cleaned and packed his gear while Lena washed as best she could in the creek, scrubbing away the worst of yesterday's ordeal. The cold water made her gasp, but it cleared her head and gave her something approaching cleanliness. When she returned to the shack, Silas had laid out some spare clothes from his saddlebags, a shirt that would be too big on her, but at least it was clean. She changed behind the blanket he'd strung up for privacy, grateful for the fresh fabric against her skin, even if it hung on her like a tent. They left the line shack as they'd found it. Fire-banked supplies organized, door secured. The horse rested and watered, accepted their weight without complaint, as Silas mounted and pulled Lena up behind him once more. "You ready for this?" he asked as they started down the trail. Lena wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid reality of him, the commitment they'd just made to each other. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." "That's the spirit." They rode south and west away from Dust Hollow and toward whatever came next. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool. Ahead, the territory stretched vast and unforgiving, full of dangers, both known and unknown. But for the first time in years, Silas Boone felt like he was riding toward something instead of away from it. And beside him, or rather behind him, was a woman who'd looked death in the face and chosen defiance instead of surrender. Together, they just might have a chance. Or they might die trying. Either way, it beat the alternative of living with regret. The town of Copper Ridge sat 30 miles southwest of Dust Hollow, nestled in a canyon where mining operations had briefly flourished before the ore ran thin and the investors pulled out. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings that served the surrounding ranches and the stubborn few who still believed the next big strike was just one more shaft away. It was the kind of place where questions weren't asked and strangers were common enough to go unnoticed, which made it exactly the sort of town where Pete Hartley might stop before crossing into Mexico. Silas and Lena reached the outskirts just after noon, the sun hammering down with renewed fury after the relative cool of the morning ride. They'd pushed hard, stopping only twice to rest the horse and refill their canteen at a stream. Lena's body ached from the ride, her wrists throbbing beneath their bandages, but she kept her complaints to herself. She'd asked for this, demanded it, really. Now she had to prove she could handle it. "We'll start at the saloon," Silas said as they rode down the main street, drawing a few curious glances, but nothing more. "Pete's got a fondness for cards and cheap whiskey. If he came through here, someone will have seen him." "And if they have, what then?" "Then we find out where he went and how long ago he left. Trail gets colder every hour, but Pete's not the cautious type. He'll leave tracks." They dismounted outside a building with a faded sign proclaiming it to be the Silver Dollar Saloon, though the paint was so weathered that the words were barely legible. Silas tied the horse to the rail and helped Lena down his hand, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle from hours in the saddle. "You all right?" "I will be." She straightened, rolling her shoulders despite the pain. "Let's do this." Inside the saloon was dim and smoky, the kind of place where daylight seemed offensive and unwelcome. A dozen men occupied various tables, most nursing drinks in that slow, purposeful way that suggested they had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry. The bartender, a thick man with forearms like hams, and a face that suggested he'd broken up more fights than he'd started, looked up as they entered. Silas approached the bar while Lena hung back, slightly conscious of how she must look in his oversized shirt and her battered state. But if the bartender noticed or cared, he gave no sign. "Help you folks." "Whiskey," Silas said, fishing coins from his pocket. "2 glasses, and information if you've got it." The bartender poured with practiced efficiency, sliding the glasses across the scarred wood. "Information costs extra." Silas added another coin to the pile. "I'm looking for a man named Pete Hartley. Big fellow, maybe 6'2" scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent moon. Would have come through here in the last day or so, probably looking nervous and spending money he shouldn't have." The bartender's eyes flicked to Lena, then back to Silas. "That a question or a statement? Whichever one gets me an answer." For a moment, the bartender said nothing, clearly calculating the value of the information against whatever loyalty or caution kept him quiet. Then he shrugged and pocketed the coins. "Man like that was in here last night. Bought drinks for half the house, played cards till near dawn, lost most of what he came in with. Was bragging about a big score, said he was heading south to start fresh. He say where south, Agua Caliente maybe, or straight to the border. He was drunk enough that his plans kept changing with every hand he lost." The bartender leaned forward, slightly lowering his voice. "But I'll tell you what I told the other fellow who came asking this morning. Pete Hartley's the kind of man who makes enemies easy and friends never. Whatever business you've got with him, I'd suggest settling it quick before he settles you first. Silas's hand tightened around his glass. What other fellow? Didn't catch a name. Young guy, maybe 25, wearing Grady Ranch colors. Asked the same questions you're asking left about 3 hours ago heading south. Lena felt ice slide down her spine. Eldon had sent someone after Pete, which meant they weren't the only ones trying to find him. And if Eldon's man reached Pete first, any evidence of the horse theft would disappear faster than morning dew in August. Silas must have reached the same conclusion because he drained his whiskey in one swallow and pushed away from the bar. Much obliged. One more thing, the bartender said as they turned to leave. Pete mentioned something about a lockbox, said he'd hidden it somewhere safe before he left Dust Hollow Insurance in case his luck turned bad. Don't know if that helps you, but it seemed important to him at the time. It helps. Thanks. Outside, the sunlight felt like a physical blow after the dimness of the saloon. Silas moved quickly to the horse, checking the saddle with practiced hands, while his mind clearly raced ahead to their next move. Eldon's man has a 3-hour lead, Lena said, stating the obvious because sometimes obvious things needed to be said. We can't catch him before he reaches Pete. No, we can't. But we might not have to. Silas finished his checks and turned to face her. If Pete hit a lockbox before he left, that means the evidence is still back in Dust Hollow somewhere. We find that box, we don't need Pete at all. But we don't know where he hid it. Could be anywhere. Could be. But Pete's not a subtle man and he's not particularly clever. He'd hide something important somewhere he could get to it easy if he needed to, somewhere close to where he worked. Silas paused, thinking. The ranch. Has to be. Question is, where on a spread that size? Lena's mind raced through the layout of Eldon's property. She'd worked there for 6 months, knew most of the buildings and land by sight, if not by intimacy. The main house, the bunkhouses, the barns, the equipment sheds, the tool storage, the old well, she said suddenly. Behind the second barn, there's an old well that dried up years ago. Eldon was supposed to fill it in, but never got around to it. Pete was always hanging around that area, said he liked the quiet when he needed to think. Silas's eyes narrowed. You think he'd hide something valuable down a dried well? I think he'd hide something valuable somewhere nobody would think to look, and nobody goes near that well because it's dangerous. Perfect spot if you lower something down on a rope and pull it back up when you need it. That's a lot of ifs and maybes. You got a better idea. Silas was quiet for a moment, clearly running through alternatives and finding them wanting. Finally, he shook his head. No, I don't. Which means we're going back to Grady's ranch. In broad daylight. In broad daylight, what? He confirmed. Because if we wait for dark, Eldon's man might make it back with Pete, and then we're done. This is our only play, Lena. It's a bad one, but it's what we've got. Lena felt fear coil in her stomach, cold and insistent. Going back to Eldon's ranch was suicide. He'd made it clear yesterday that she wasn't welcome, that taking her back would mean consequences. And now they were proposing to not just return, but to sneak onto his property and steal evidence that could ruin him. But what choice did they have? All right, she said, forcing steel into her voice. Let's go rob the man who wants me dead. What could possibly go wrong? Silas almost smiled. That's the spirit. They mounted up and rode north, retracing their path back toward Dust Hollow. The landscape passed in a blur of heat and dust, each mile bringing them closer to danger and whatever waited at the end of this desperate gamble. Lena's mind kept circling back to the image of herself tied to that fence post sun, cooking her alive, and she had to consciously push the memory away. Fear was useful in small doses, kept you sharp and careful, but too much would paralyze, and she couldn't afford paralysis now. Tell me something, she said after they'd been riding for an hour. Why did you really quit being a marshal? Silas was quiet for so long that Lena thought he might not answer. Then slowly, carefully, he began to speak. There was a girl, 14 years old, daughter of a rancher up in Colorado. She was taken by outlaws, 3 men who robbed her father and decided she'd make good insurance against pursuit. I tracked them for 2 weeks, finally caught up to them in a canyon just across the border into New Mexico. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man reciting facts he'd long since stopped feeling. I called for them to surrender, told them they were surrounded even though it was just me. One of them panicked, put a gun to the girl's head, said he'd kill her if I didn't back off. Lena's arms tightened around his waist. I made a decision. Thought I could take the shot before he could pull the trigger. Thought I was that good that fast, that blessed by God or fate or whatever you want to call it. He paused. I was wrong. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. The girl died, Lena said softly. The girl died. And the outlaw died. And the other two surrendered. And I brought them in, and everyone said I did the right thing, that it wasn't my fault that these things happen in the line of duty. But she was 14 years old, and she died because I thought I was good enough to save her. Silas, I turned in my badge the next day. Couldn't stomach the idea of making another call like that, of deciding who lives and who dies based on split-second judgment and the draw of a gun. Couldn't look at myself in the mirror and see anything but the man who killed a child trying to save her. Lena rested her forehead against his back, feeling the tension in his body, the old pain that never quite healed. That's why you carry so much weight. That's why every failure feels like the end of the world. That's why I don't get to fail anymore. Don't get to make mistakes that cost lives. He paused. Which is why what we're about to do scares the hell out of me. Because if I mess this up, if I make the wrong call again, it's not just me who pays the price. Then we won't mess it up. We'll be careful, we'll be smart, and we'll get out alive. You sound awfully confident for someone who was tied to a fence post yesterday. I sound confident because I have to be. Because the alternative is giving up, and I'm done giving up. She lifted her head, looking out at the landscape rolling past. My father gave up. He let the weight of accusation crush him until there was nothing left but bitterness and bottles. I won't do that. I can't. So either we succeed at this crazy plan, or we die trying, but we don't quit. Silas reached down and briefly squeezed her hand where it rested against his stomach. It was a small gesture gone almost as soon as it happened, but it carried volumes. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly. I hope so. God knows I'm terrified enough for both of us. They reached the outskirts of Eldon's ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, shadows stretching long across the dusty earth. Silas guided them to a low ridge that overlooked the property, a position that offered a clear view while keeping them concealed behind scrub oak and boulders. The ranch looked much as it had yesterday. Buildings arranged in a rough semicircle corrals holding horses, the big house standing proud at the center of it all. But now Lena saw it through different eyes, seeing not her place of employment, but a battlefield where the next few hours would determine everything. There, she said, pointing toward the far side of the property where two barns stood side by side. The old well is between the second barn and that line of cottonwoods. You can barely see it from here, but it's there. Silas studied the layout with the practiced eye of someone who'd planned more raids and rescues than he probably cared to remember. Security. Pete would know better than me, but when I worked there, Eldon usually had two men on watch at night, one near the house, one patrolling the perimeter. During the day, everyone's working spread out across the property. Which means our best bet is to wait until dark slip in when the watch changes, get what we need, and get out before anyone notices we were there. That's hours away. What do we do until then? We watch, we wait, we make sure nothing changes that would screw up our plan. He dismounted and helped Lena down, then led the horse back into deeper cover where it wouldn't be visible from the ranch. And we rest while we can, no telling when we'll get another chance. They settled into the rocks, positioned so they could see the ranch without being seen. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness, the sun inching across the sky, while they watched ranch hands move about their business below. Lena recognized several of them men she'd worked alongside, shared meals with, traded jokes and complaints with. Now they were obstacles, potential enemies who would raise the alarm if they spotted her. The thought made her chest tight. Second thoughts, Silas asked, reading her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. About 100 of them, but I'm not backing out if that's what you're asking. Wasn't asking, just checking. What about you? Any second thoughts about helping a woman you barely know commit what amounts to breaking and entering? Silas smiled grimly. I stopped counting my second thoughts around the time I agreed to this insanity. Now I'm just committed to seeing it through. Even if it gets us killed. Especially then. At least dying for something worthwhile beats the slow death I've been living for the past few years. They fell silent after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the day wound down toward evening. Lena found herself thinking about her father again, about the choices that had brought her to this moment. If Marcus Whitmore had made different decisions, if he'd fought harder against the accusations, or accepted them with more grace. Would she still be here? Or would she be somewhere else entirely, living some other life, making some other mistakes? But that was the thing about choices. You made them with the information you had at the time, and then you lived with the consequences whether you wanted to or not. Her father had chosen bitterness and bottles. She was choosing defiance and danger. Maybe neither choice was right, but at least hers felt true. The sun finally touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that would have been beautiful if Lena hadn't been so tense she could barely breathe. Lights began appearing in windows across the ranch as lamps were lit against the gathering dark. The day shift workers headed toward the bunkhouses while night watch prepared to take their positions. Silas checked his rifle, his pistol, his knife, moving through the familiar ritual of preparing for action. Remember the plan. We go in quiet, we move fast, we don't engage unless we absolutely have to. Get to the well, get the lockbox if it's there, get out. Clean and simple. Nothing about this is clean or simple. No, but we can pretend until reality proves otherwise. Full darkness fell like a curtain, stars emerging overhead in their thousands. A thin crescent moon provided just enough light to see by without exposing them completely. Perfect conditions for what they were about to attempt, if you didn't count the armed men, the dangerous territory, and the very real possibility of dying before dawn. Silas rose and moved toward the horse, pulling his rifle from the scabbard. Lena followed her heart, hammering so hard she was surprised it didn't echo across the canyon. This was it. The moment where they either succeeded or failed, lived or died, proved themselves worthy of the second chance they were trying to claim. "Ready," Silas whispered. Lena nodded, not trusting her voice. They left the horse hidden in the rocks and began their descent toward the ranch on foot, moving slowly and carefully, testing each step before committing their weight. The darkness helped, but it also made every sound seem amplified, the scrape of boot against stone, the rustle of cloth, the ragged edge of their breathing. They reached the bottom of the ridge and paused, crouching behind a low wall that had once marked the boundary of a pasture. From here they could see the second barn, clearly could make out the dark shape of the cottonwoods beyond it. Somewhere in that darkness was the old well, and hopefully the evidence that would prove Lena's innocence. A figure moved between buildings, one of the night watch making his rounds. Silas held up a hand signaling Lena to freeze, and they waited in tense silence while the guard passed within 30 feet of their position. He was whistling tunelessly, rifle slung over his shoulder, clearly not expecting trouble. When he disappeared around the far side of the barn, Silas moved. They crossed the open ground at a low run, footsteps muffled by thick dust, and pressed themselves against the barn wall. Lena's breath came in short gasps, partly from exertion, but mostly from fear. They were inside the perimeter now, exposed and vulnerable, committed to a course of action that might already be too late to abort. Silas edged along the barn wall toward the back, Lena following close behind. The cottonwoods loomed ahead, their branches whispering in the night breeze. And there, barely visible in the starlight, was the old well, a stone structure maybe 4 feet high, covered with weathered boards to keep animals and unwary people from falling in. They reached it without incident, and Silas immediately began removing the boards, setting them aside as quietly as possible. The well opened like a mouth, dark and deep and silent. Lena peered down into it, but could see nothing beyond the first few feet. "If there's anything down there, we're going to need rope and light," she whispered. Silas was already pulling a coil of rope from his belt. "Light's too risky. We'll have to do this blind." He tied one end of the rope to a solid post of the well structure, then began feeding the other end down into the darkness. The rope played out slowly, 10 feet, 20, 30, until finally it went slack. "Bottom's about 35 feet down," Silas said. "I'll go. You keep watch." "Like hell. I know what we're looking for and I'm smaller. Makes more sense for me to go." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but logic won out over chivalry. "Fine. But if you hear or see anything wrong, you pull on this rope 3 times fast. I'll haul you up." Lena took hold of the rope, testing its strength. It felt solid, which was about as much reassurance as she was going to get. She swung her legs over the edge of the well, the darkness below seeming to pull at her like a living thing, then began her descent. The rope bit into her bandaged palms, sending fresh pain shooting through her wrists, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Hand under hand, feet braced against the stone walls, she lowered herself into the earth. The darkness swallowed her completely, and for a moment she felt panic rising. This was a tomb, a pit, a place where things went to be forgotten. Then her feet touched bottom, and reality reasserted itself. The bottom of the well was dry, just as Lena had said, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust and debris. She ran her hands along the walls, searching by touch for anything that didn't belong: a box, a bag, anything Pete might have hidden. Nothing on the first sweep. She expanded her search, moving around the circular space, fingers probing every crack and crevice. Still nothing. Had they been wrong? Had Pete hidden his insurance somewhere else entirely? Then her foot kicked something that rattled. Lena dropped to her knees, hands searching the floor until they closed around something hard and rectangular. Metal, about the size of a large book with a lock on one end. A lockbox. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. They'd been right. Pete had hidden evidence here, and now it was in her hands. She tugged on the rope, one sharp pull to signal success, then secured the box to her belt using a leather strap Silas had given her. The climb back up was harder than the descent, her arms shaking from exertion and adrenaline, but she focused on one hand at a time, one foot after another, until finally she felt Silas's hands grip her arms and haul her over the edge. "Got it," he whispered urgently. She patted the box at her waist. "Got it. Then let's move before—" Light exploded across the yard, bright and blinding. Voices shouted. Footsteps pounded toward them from multiple directions. They'd been discovered. Silas grabbed Lena's hand and ran, pulling her toward the cottonwoods, where darkness still offered some concealment. Behind them, men yelled for them to stop, to surrender, threats and promises mixing in a chaotic chorus. A gunshot cracked the night, and bark exploded from a tree trunk inches from Lena's head. They were shooting to kill. "Through the trees!" Silas shouted, abandoning stealth for speed. "Head for the creek." They crashed through underbrush branches, whipping at their faces and arms. More shots rang out closer now, and Lena realized with sick certainty that they weren't going to make it. There were too many men, too much open ground to cover too little darkness to hide in. Then Silas stopped so suddenly she nearly ran into him. A figure stood blocking their path, rifle raised, face hard in the starlight. Tom Jessup, the young ranch hand who'd guarded Lena during her ordeal yesterday. The boy who hadn't been able to shoot Silas when given the chance. "Don't," Tom said, voice shaking but determined. "Don't make me do this." Silas raised his hands slowly, rifle still gripped in his right but not pointing at anyone. "Tom, listen to me. Let us pass and you walk away from this clean. Nobody has to know you saw us. Everyone will know I saw you. The whole ranch is awake." Tom's finger tightened on the trigger. "Mr. Grady will kill me if I let you go. Eldon's going to kill a lot of people before this is over. Don't let yourself be one of them." For a moment, Tom wavered. Lena could see the conflict on his young face, the war between self-preservation and whatever loyalty or fear kept him in Eldon's service. Then his jaw set, and she knew what he was going to do. The rifle came up, aiming center mass at Silas. Time seemed to slow, stretching the moment into something eternal and terrible. Lena saw Tom's finger begin to squeeze, saw Silas start to move, knew with absolute certainty that someone was about to die. Then a shotgun blast shattered the night from somewhere to their left, and Tom went down crying out and clutching his leg where buckshot had torn through flesh. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman maybe 30, with hard eyes and a harder expression. She held a double-barreled shotgun like she knew exactly how to use it, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from too many years of taking orders. "Go," she said simply. "Before I change my mind about which side I'm on." Silas didn't question the gift. He grabbed Lena's hand again, and they ran, leaving Tom writhing on the ground and the mysterious woman standing guard over him. They crashed through the creek water, soaking them to the knees, and scrambled up the far bank into the maze of rocks and scrub that marked the boundary of Eldon's property. Shouts echoed behind them, but the shots had stopped. Maybe their savior was buying them time. Maybe Eldon's men had lost them in the darkness. Either way, they kept running, pushing themselves until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached the ridge where they'd left the horse. The animal stood waiting calm despite the chaos, and Silas wasted no time getting them both mounted. "Who was that woman?" Lena gasped as they started riding north away from the ranch and toward whatever safety they could find. "No idea, but remind me to send her a thank you note if we survive this." They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Eldon's ranch. The lockbox bounced against Lena's hip, with every stride a constant reminder of what they'd risked everything to obtain. Whether it contained the proof they needed or was just another dead end remained to be seen, but right now survival took priority over curiosity. Dawn was breaking by the time they felt safe enough to stop the eastern sky, painting itself in shades of pink and gold. They'd ridden at least 15 miles following game trails and old mining roads that would make them difficult to track. The horse was exhausted foam flecking its neck, and both Silas and Lena were running on adrenaline and desperation. They found a small canyon with an overhang that offered concealment and water from a spring that trickled down the rock face. Silas dismounted and helped Lena down, both of them moving like people 20 years older than they were. "Let me see it," Silas said, gesturing to the lockbox. Lena unstrapped it from her belt and handed it over. In the growing light, she could see it was a simple metal box secured with a padlock that had seen better days. Nothing fancy, but functional. Silas examined the lock, then pulled his knife and wedged it into the mechanism. 2 quick twists, and the lock popped open, the cheap metal giving way without much protest. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with string. Silas removed them carefully and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up at Lena with something like grim satisfaction. "This is it. Bills of sale receipts, even a letter from a horse trader in Yuma, confirming Pete sold him a stallion matching the description of Eldon's missing horse. Pete documented everything. Why would he keep evidence of his own crime? Insurance, leverage? If Eldon ever tried to cheat him or throw him under, Pete could threaten to expose the whole thing." Silas shuffled through the papers again. "There's more here, too. Evidence of other thefts, other schemes. Pete was skimming from Eldon for years, and he kept records of all of it." Lena felt hope surge in her chest, hot and bright and almost painful. "Then we have him. We can prove I didn't steal that horse. We can clear my name. We can do more than that. With this evidence, we can bring Eldon down, show everyone what kind of man he really is." But even as he said it, Lena saw the doubt in his eyes. Having evidence was one thing. Getting anyone to act on it was another. Eldon Grady was powerful, connected, the kind of man who'd built an empire on intimidation and selective justice. Taking him down would require more than papers in a lockbox. It would require a fight. And judging by the way Silas was looking at those documents, that fight was just beginning. "What now?" Lena asked. Silas carefully refolded the papers and secured them back in the box. "Now we find someone brave enough or stupid enough to stand up to Eldon Grady with us. Someone with authority who can't be bought or intimidated. Does such a person even exist out here? They'd better, because if they don't, we just risked our lives for nothing." He stood and moved to check on the horse, leaving Lena alone with her thoughts and the lockbox that had become both their salvation and their curse. She thought about the woman who'd saved them, wondered who she was and why she'd helped. Thought about Tom Jessup lying wounded in the dirt. Thought about the long road ahead and all the ways this could still go wrong. But mostly she thought about her father, about the vindication that had come too late to save him. She wouldn't let the same thing happen to her. Whatever it took, however dangerous the road ahead, she would see this through. She would prove that Whitmores weren't thieves or liars or people to be discarded when convenient. She would stand in the sun again with her head held high. And if Eldon Grady wanted to stop her, he'd have to kill her first. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool. In the distance, smoke rose from Dust Hollow, a thin column reaching toward an indifferent sky. Somewhere down there, Eldon was learning. What they'd done was planning. His response was gathering his forces for whatever came next. The war had begun, and Lena Whitmore intended to win it. They stayed in the canyon through the heat of the day, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Lena found sleep impossible despite her exhaustion, her mind racing through scenarios and possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. The lockbox sat between them, like a promise or a curse depending on how you looked at it, and she couldn't stop staring at it. Silas had been quiet for hours, lost in his own thoughts, occasionally pulling out the papers to study them as if the words might change if he looked long enough. Finally, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, he spoke. There's a territorial judge named Abernathy. Circuit Rider comes through this area every 6 weeks or so. He's due in Silver City in 3 days. Silas looked up from the documents, his gray eyes hard with determination. He's one of the few men I know who can't be bought and won't be intimidated. If we can get this evidence to him, he'll act on it. 3 days is a long time when Eldon's hunting us. It is, but it's also our only real shot. Local sheriffs in these parts are either on Eldon's payroll or too scared of him to matter. Abernathy's different. He answers to the territorial governor, and he's got a reputation for being harder than a coffin nail when it comes to corruption. Lena pulled her knees to her chest, hugging them close. So we run to Silver City and hope we make it there before Eldon catches us. That's about the size of it, yeah? And if Abernathy won't help, if he decides the evidence isn't enough, or he doesn't want to tangle with someone as powerful as Eldon. Silas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Lena's chest tight. Then we tried, and trying matters even when it fails. Does it really matter if we end up dead in a ditch somewhere with nothing to show for it but good intentions? Yes. The certainty in that single word was absolute. Because the alternative is accepting that men like Eldon Grady get to do whatever they want to whoever they want, and the rest of us just live with it. I've spent too many years accepting that reality, Lena. I'm done. She studied his face in the fading light, seeing the lines that marked it, the scars both visible and invisible. This man had carried guilt and regret for so long it had become part of him, inseparable from breath and bone. And now he was offering her something precious, not just help, but partnership in defiance. The chance to stand against injustice, even if standing meant falling. All right, she said softly. Silver City, 3 days. We'll make it work. We'll have to travel at night, avoid the main roads. Eldon will have men out looking for us by now, probably offered a reward. Can't trust anyone we meet. So basically, we're fugitives running for our lives with stolen evidence and a prayer. Silas almost smiled. When you put it that way, it sounds downright suicidal. That's because it is. Yeah, but at least we'll go down fighting. They prepared to move as soon as full darkness fell, checking their weapons and supplies with the methodical care of people who understood that small mistakes could have fatal consequences. The horse had recovered from the morning's hard ride, but Silas was worried about pushing it too hard for too long. A lame horse in hostile territory was a death sentence. We'll need to steal another mount, he said, voicing what Lena had already been thinking. Or trade for one. Can't make it to Silver City on one horse carrying 2 riders, not in 3 days. Stealing horses. That's ironic considering what we're trying to prove I didn't do. Life's full of little ironies. This is just one more. As they saddled up and prepared to leave the canyon, Lena found herself looking back at the small space that had sheltered them. It had been safe quiet, removed from the chaos they were riding toward. Part of her wanted to stay to hide here until the world forgot about them. But that wasn't an option, had never really been an option. Some things couldn't be run from, only faced. They rode northwest, keeping to rough country where pursuit would be difficult. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead, and for hours the only sounds were hoofbeats against stone and the occasional call of a nightbird hunting. Lena's body ached from too much riding and too little proper rest, but she forced herself to stay alert, scanning the darkness for threats that might appear without warning. Around midnight, they spotted lights in the distance, a small ranch or homestead isolated enough to be off the main routes, but close enough to civilization that it had to be connected somehow. Silas studied it for a long time before making his decision. We'll approach on foot, see if we can trade or buy a horse. I've got some money, and if they're decent folk, they might be willing to deal. And if they're not decent folk, then we take what we need and leave payment anyway. I'm not going to steal from someone who doesn't deserve it, but I'm also not going to let pride get us killed. They dismounted and approached the homestead, cautiously leading Silas's horse rather than riding it. As they got closer, details emerged: a small house, a barn, a corral with several horses visible in the starlight. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in one window. Someone was awake. Silas called out before they got too close, not wanting to surprise anyone who might be quick with a gun. "Hello, the house. We're looking to trade. Don't mean any harm." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the front door opened a crack, and a woman's voice called back, suspicious and wary. "Trade for what? And who's we?" "Horse for horse plus cash. I'm Silas Boone, used to be a territorial marshal. This is Lena Whitmore. We're passing through on urgent business and need a fresh mount." The door opened wider and a woman stepped out holding a rifle with confident familiarity. She was maybe 45, weathered by sun and work with eyes that assessed them both with sharp intelligence. "Used to be a marshal." "What are you now?" "Honestly, I'm a man trying to do one right thing before I die. And she's a woman who got accused of something she didn't do. We've got evidence that can prove her innocence, but we need to get to Silver City before the people who framed her catch up with us." The woman studied them for what felt like an eternity, her rifle never wavering. Then she lowered it slightly and called over her shoulder, "James, get out here." A man appeared in the doorway, younger than the woman, but clearly her husband or partner. He was lean and hard, with the look of someone who'd fought his share of battles and won most of them. "These people need a horse," the woman said. "Say they're running from trouble heading to Silver City." "We can pay," Silas added quickly. "Fair price plus extra for the inconvenience." James came down off the porch, moving with the easy confidence of a man on his own land. He walked around them in a slow circle, taking in their condition, the bandages on Lena's wrists, the exhaustion in both their faces, the way Silas's hand stayed near his gun without actually touching it. "What kind of troubles?" James asked finally. "The kind that involves a powerful rancher, a false accusation, and men with guns who don't much care about the truth," Lena said, deciding that honesty was their best bet. "I was accused of stealing a horse I never touched. Silas helped me, and now we're both marked. We just need to get to a judge who can hear the evidence." "Eldon Grady," the woman said, and it wasn't a question. "That's who you're running from." Silas and Lena exchanged glances. "You know him, know of him. Everyone in this part of the territory does. Man's got more power than the law, and twice as much mean." The woman looked at her husband, some silent communication passing between them. "We lost a cousin to Eldon 5 years back. Boy got crossways with one of Eldon's foremen, ended up dead in a ravine. Sheriff said it was an accident. We knew better." The air seemed to shift tension, replaced by something almost like alliance. James nodded once, decisive. "We'll trade you a horse. Good one too, not some broken-down nag. And we won't take payment. Consider it our contribution to seeing Eldon Grady get what's coming to him." "I can't ask you to do that," Silas said. "You didn't ask. We're offering." The woman stepped forward, extending her hand. "Name's Martha. This is my husband, James. We're not brave enough to stand up to Eldon ourselves, but we can help those who are." Lena shook Martha's hand, feeling the calluses, the strength in that grip. "Thank you. You don't know what this means." "I think I do. Now, come on. Let's get you that horse before someone spots your fire glow over the ridge." They followed Martha and James to the barn where 3 horses stood in stalls. James pointed to a buckskin gelding in the corner, strong-looking and clear-eyed. "That's Dancer. 5 years old, sound as $1, and he'll run all day if you need him to. Rode him myself to Colorado and back last year." Silas examined the horse with practiced hands, checking legs, teeth, temperament. "This is too fine an animal. We can't take him for nothing." "You can, and you will," Martha said firmly. "But you'll also take some supplies, food, water, ammunition if you need it, and you'll promise me that when you get to Judge Abernathy, you'll make sure he knows about our cousin, about Lucas Hayes, who died because he had the audacity to stand up for himself against one of Eldon's men." "I promise," Lena said, meaning it with everything in her. They spent 20 minutes in that barn preparing Dancer for the journey and accepting supplies that Martha insisted they take. Dried meat, hardtack coffee, even a blanket that looked like it had been in the family for generations. Kindness from strangers in a hard land, and Lena felt her throat tighten with gratitude. As they prepared to leave, Martha pulled Lena aside, speaking quietly so the men wouldn't hear. "That man you're riding with, Silas Boone, He's carrying a weight that's crushing him. Anyone with eyes can see it, but he's good deep down. Don't let him sacrifice himself thinking it'll balance some cosmic ledger. Make him live through this. Make him see there's still reasons to keep going. Lena nodded, not trusting her voice. And you, Martha continued, gripping Lena's arm. You've got fire in you. I can see it. Don't let men like Eldon Grady put it out. The world needs women who burn. They mounted their horses, Silas on his roan, Lena on Dancer, and turned north toward Silver City and whatever waited there. As they rode away, Martha and James stood in their doorway, silhouetted by lamplight, watching until distance swallowed them. Good people, Silas said after a while. The best kind. The kind who help even when it costs them. They rode hard through what remained of the night, covering ground with desperate efficiency. With 2 horses, they could alternate which one carried more weight, giving both animals a better chance at lasting the journey. Dancer proved to be everything James had promised, strong, steady, and willing. Dawn found them 20 miles from Martha and James's homestead, hidden in a stand of pines that offered concealment and a clear view of the trail behind them. No sign of pursuit yet, but Silas's instincts were screaming that it was only a matter of time. We should rest here through the day, he said. Push hard again tonight. Lena dismounted, her legs shaking from exhaustion. How far to Silver City? Maybe 70 miles, give or take. If we keep this pace, we'll make it with a day to spare before Abernathy arrives. And if Eldon catches us first... Silas didn't answer, which was answer enough. They made a cold camp, no fire, no unnecessary movement. Lena tried to sleep but managed only a fitful doze, her dreams full of gunfire and flames. When she woke in the early afternoon, Silas was standing, watch rifle across his knees, staring at something in the distance. What is it? She asked, moving to join him. Riders, 3 of them, maybe 4. Can't tell if they're Eldon's men or just travelers, but they're following the same route we took last night. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. Did they see us? Don't think so, but they will if we stay here much longer. We need to move even if it means traveling in daylight. They saddled up quickly and rode deeper into the pine forest, following game trails that would hide their tracks. The horses moved quietly over pine needles, but every snapped twig made Lena flinch, certain they'd been discovered. Behind them, the sound of other horses grew closer. Voices calling to each other in tones that carried threat and eagerness. They're hunting, Silas said quietly. And they're good at it. They pushed the horses to move faster, abandoning caution for speed. The forest blurred around them, trees flashing past the ground, rising and falling in ways that made Lena's stomach lurch. She could hear the pursuers now, definitely closer, definitely gaining. Then the trees opened up ahead and they found themselves at the edge of a ravine maybe 30 feet across, with a creek running through the bottom 50 feet below. The only way forward was to backtrack or jump, and backtracking meant riding straight into their pursuers. Can the horses make it? Lena asked, already knowing Silas was calculating the same thing. I don't know. That's a hell of a jump. We don't have a choice. Behind them, voices called out they'd been spotted. Silas looked at the ravine, looked at Lena, and made his decision. We jump together. Give the horses their heads and trust them. If we make it, we keep riding and don't look back. If we don't... He didn't finish the thought. Lena nodded, her mouth too dry for words. She backed Dancer up, giving him room to build speed, and saw Silas doing the same with his roan. The sound of pursuit was loud now, men crashing through the underbrush, calling for them to stop. Now! Silas shouted and kicked his horse forward. Lena did the same, and Dancer leaped forward with powerful strides. The edge of the ravine rushed toward them, and for one crystalline moment, Lena saw everything with perfect clarity. The rocks below the water catching sunlight, the impossible distance they were trying to cross. Then Dancer gathered himself and jumped, and they were airborne. Time stretched. The world became nothing but empty space and the sickening sensation of falling. Lena leaned forward, giving Dancer his head, praying to any god that might be listening. She heard rather than saw Silas's horse beside her. Both animals stretched out in flight hooves, churning air. They hit the far side hard, Dancer's front hooves catching the edge and scrambling for purchase. For one terrible second, Lena thought they were going to slide backward into the ravine. Then Dancer found solid ground and surged forward, carrying them away from the edge. Silas's roan landed a heartbeat later, stumbling but recovering, and they were both across, both alive, both still moving. Behind them, the pursuers reached the ravine and stopped, clearly unwilling to make the same jump. Shouts of frustration echoed across the gap, followed by gunshots that fell short. Bullets whining through the air, nowhere near their targets. Lena and Silas didn't slow down until they'd put 2 more miles between themselves and the ravine, finally stopping in another grove of trees where both horses stood, heaving foam, flecking their necks. "That was insane," Lena gasped, sliding from Dancer's back on legs that barely held her. "That was necessary," Silas corrected, though his own hands were shaking as he dismounted. "And it bought us time. They'll have to go around, add miles to their route. We've got maybe a 6-hour lead now." "Will it be enough?" "It'll have to be." They walked the horses to cool them down, checking for injuries and finding none beyond exhaustion. Both animals had performed like champions, and Lena found herself stroking Dancer's neck with genuine affection. This horse had just saved her life. They rested for an hour, letting the horses recover, while Silas studied a map he'd pulled from his saddlebag. "There's a town called Redemption, about 15 miles northwest of here. Small place, but they've got a telegraph office. We could wire ahead to Silver City, let Abernathy know we're coming and why." "Won't that tip off Eldon too?" "Maybe, but it also means if something happens to us, someone will know the truth. The evidence won't die with us." It was a grim calculus, but Lena understood the logic. "All right, Redemption, then Silver City. We're almost there." "Almost?" Silas agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe in almost anymore. He believed in finished or failed, and they weren't finished yet. They reached Redemption just after dark, riding into a town that barely deserved the name, maybe 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads, most of them dark and silent. The telegraph office was still open, a small shack with lamplight spilling from its windows, and a bored-looking operator inside. Silas composed the message carefully, while Lena kept watch outside, every shadow seeming to hide threats. The message was brief and to the point. "Have evidence of corruption and false accusation against Eldon Grady. Arriving Silver City 2 days. Request protection and immediate hearing. Silas Boone." The operator sent it without comment, probably used to cryptic messages that hinted at darker stories. Silas paid, and they left quickly, not wanting to linger anywhere long enough to be remembered. 2 miles outside Redemption, as they rode through darkness toward their final destination, Lena finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since they jumped that ravine. "When this is over, when we've given Abernathy the evidence and done everything we can, what then? What happens to us?" Silas was quiet for a long time, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves against packed earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, like a man approaching a cliff edge in the dark. "I don't know. Haven't let myself think that far ahead." "Why not?" "Because thinking about tomorrow requires believing you'll see it. And I stopped believing that a long time ago." "That's a hell of a way to live." "It's the only way I know how." Lena urged Dancer closer until she was riding alongside Silas rather than behind. In the starlight, his profile was all hard angles and shadows, a face carved by regret and loneliness. "Martha was right," Lena said. "You're carrying weight that's killing you, and somewhere along the way you decided that was your punishment, your cross to bear, until it finally drags you under. But Silas, that's not justice. That's just slow suicide. Some of us deserve slow suicide." "No. No, we don't." She reached out and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "You made a mistake. A terrible one, I'm not minimizing that. But you've spent years paying for it, years trying to make amends. At some point you have to forgive yourself. You have to decide that you're worth saving too." "Am I, because I'm not so sure anymore?" "I'm sure. You pulled me off that post when you could have kept riding. You've risked your life a dozen times over the past 3 days for someone you barely know. You've given me a chance to clear my name and stand tall again. If that's not worth something, if that doesn't balance at least part of the ledger, then I don't know what does." Silas's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. When he spoke, his voice was raw. "I don't know how to let it go, Lena. Don't know how to look at myself without seeing that girl's face, without hearing her father's screams when they told him she was dead. It's been 5 years, and it's still the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I see before I sleep. How do you forgive yourself for that?" I don't know, but maybe you start by accepting that you're human, that humans make mistakes, and that spending the rest of your life punishing yourself doesn't bring her back. Maybe you start by doing what we're doing now, fighting for something good, standing up, when it's easier to walk away being the man you used to be before tragedy tried to bury you. They rode in silence after that, both lost in thoughts too heavy for words. The night deepened around them, and somewhere ahead Silver City waited with its promise of justice or final failure. Behind them, Eldon's men pursued, probably closer than Silas wanted to admit. But for this moment, riding through darkness toward an uncertain dawn, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not the naive kind that believed everything would work out perfectly, but the harder, more resilient hope that knew darkness existed but chose to light a candle anyway. They made camp one final time as the sky began to lighten in the east, hiding themselves in rocks that overlooked the trail they'd been following. Silver City lay just 15 miles ahead now, so close Lena could almost taste it. One more day, one more push. Then they'd put this evidence in Abernathy's hands and let justice, whatever that meant, take its course. "Get some sleep," Silas said, taking first watch. "I'll wake you in a few hours." Lena lay down on hard ground, using her saddle as a pillow, and closed her eyes. Sleep came surprisingly fast, pulling her under into dreams, where she stood before a judge with her father beside her, both of them finally vindicated, finally free. She woke to Silas shaking her shoulder, his face tight with worry. The sun had climbed higher than she'd expected. She'd slept through her watch shift. "Why didn't you wake me?" she asked, sitting up too fast and immediately regretting it as her head spun. "You needed the rest more than I needed the company." He pointed toward the trail below. "Besides, we've got bigger problems now." Lena followed his gesture and felt her stomach drop. 6 riders were coming up the trail, moving fast, and even at this distance she could see the distinctive colors of Eldon's ranch hands. They'd been found again. "How long until they reach us?" 20 minutes, maybe less. Not enough time to outrun them all the way to Silver City. "So what do we do?" Silas checked his rifle. His pistol counted his ammunition with practiced efficiency. "We make our stand here. High ground, good cover, clear field of fire. They'll have to come at us uphill, which gives us the advantage. Maybe we can hold them off long enough that someone from Silver City hears the shooting and comes to investigate. And if nobody comes..." He met her eyes, and she saw acceptance there, the calm of a man who'd made peace with mortality a long time ago. "Then we make them pay for every inch, and we die, knowing we tried everything." Lena pulled out the small pistol Silas had given her 2 days ago, checking its load with hands that only shook a little. "Not quite how I pictured this ending." "Me neither. But then again, I stopped expecting good endings years ago." He positioned himself behind a boulder that offered good cover and sight lines down the trail. "When the shooting starts, keep your head down. Don't try to be a hero. Just stay alive as long as you can. Same to you." The riders came on, and Lena could make out faces now, hard men who'd spent their lives taking orders from someone like Eldon Grady. Men who wouldn't lose sleep over killing 2 fugitives in the middle of nowhere. The lead rider was the one she recognized from Copper Ridge, the man Eldon had sent after Pete Hartley. He'd failed at that mission, which meant he had extra motivation to succeed at this one. Silas let them get within 100 yards before he called out, voice carrying clear and strong across the rocks. "That's far enough. Come any closer and we start shooting." The riders stopped, fanning out slightly, hands moving toward weapons. The lead rider called back, his voice full of false reason. "Now, Silas, there's no need for this to get ugly. Mr. Grady just wants his property back, the girl and whatever she stole from his ranch. You hand them over peaceful-like, and we all ride away from this without any blood spilled." "Property." Silas's laugh was harsh. "She's a human being, not property, and what she stole is evidence that proves she never stole anything in the first place. So here's my counteroffer. You boys turn around and ride back to Eldon. Tell him his days of terrorizing innocent people are done. The truth's coming out whether he likes it or not." "Can't do that, Silas. You know I can't." "Then I guess we're at an impasse." For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. Then one of Eldon's men made the mistake of reaching for his gun, and everything exploded into violence. Silas's first shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. Return fire erupted immediately, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up dirt. Lena fired her pistol at the nearest target, missing but forcing him to take cover. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a cacophony of death that filled the world. The fight descended into chaos, a desperate exchange of gunfire between people who understood that only one side would walk away from this. Lena fired until her pistol was empty, then reloaded with shaking hands while Silas provided covering fire. Two of Eldon's men were down, one clearly dead and one writhing in pain. But there were still four left, and they were working their way around the flanks trying to get better angles. A bullet struck the rock inches from Lena's head, showering her with stone chips. She ducked lower, heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was how it ended, she realized with strange clarity. Not in a courtroom with vindication, but in a pile of rocks with bullets in her back. Then she heard something that made no sense, more gunfire, but from a different direction, and men shouting in confusion and pain. The pressure on their position eased as Eldon's men turned to face this new threat. Silas risked a look over his cover and let out a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. "I'll be damned." Lena looked too and saw riders coming hard from the direction of Silver City, at least 8 of them, wearing badges that caught sunlight. And at their head, sitting tall in her saddle with that same shotgun from 2 nights ago, was the woman who'd saved them at Eldon's ranch. The fight was over in minutes. Eldon's men, outnumbered and outgunned, threw down their weapons and surrendered. The woman dismounted and walked toward Silas and Lena's position, her expression somewhere between amused and exasperated. "You two got a talent for finding trouble," she said by way of greeting. Silas stood slowly, rifle lowering but not quite pointing at the ground. "Who the hell are you?" "Deputy Marshal Catherine Webb. Territorial appointment, same jurisdiction you used to work." She pulled her badge from her vest pocket and showed it to him. "Got your telegram from Redemption. Judge Abernathy sent me and my posse to make sure you made it to Silver City alive. Looks like we got here just in time." Lena wanted to laugh or cry, or possibly both. They'd been saved, again, by someone who actually had authority to make it stick this time. "Thank you." She managed the words, feeling inadequate. "You saved our lives." "Not the first time," Catherine said with a slight smile. "Though next time you decide to rob a powerful rancher in the middle of the night, maybe give me some advance warning so I can provide proper backup." "You were at Eldon's ranch," Silas said, understanding dawning. "You shot Tom Jessup." "In the leg where it wouldn't kill him. Kid'll recover, though he'll probably reconsider his employment choices." Catherine gestured to her posse who were securing Eldon's men. "I've been working undercover at Grady's ranch for 3 months gathering evidence of his various crimes. When I saw you two breaking into that well, I figured you were either incredibly stupid or incredibly brave. Turned out to be both." "Why didn't you identify yourself then?" "Because my cover wasn't complete yet, and I couldn't risk Eldon figuring out what I was. But your telegram changed things. If you've got evidence of false accusation and horse theft combined with what I've gathered on intimidation, extortion, and 2 suspicious deaths, we can bring Eldon down for good." She looked at Lena. "So I'm going to ask you once plain and clear, you got proof that you didn't steal Eldon Grady's horse?" Lena pulled the lockbox from her saddlebag and handed it over. "Pete Hartley's insurance policy, bills of sale receipts, even a confession of sorts. It's all there." Catherine opened the box and flipped through the papers, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finished, she looked up with something like satisfaction. "This is good, real good. Combined with my testimony and the other evidence we've gathered, Eldon's going to be facing serious time in a territorial prison." "He'll fight it," Silas said. "He's got money influence friends in high places." "He does, but Judge Abernathy's got a federal appointment and the full weight of the territorial government behind him. Eldon's not bigger than the law, much as he likes to think he is." Catherine turned to her posse. "Get these men secured and ready to transport. We're taking everyone back to Silver City, prisoners, witnesses, and heroes alike." The ride to Silver City felt surreal, like moving through a dream where danger had been replaced by protection and isolation by community. Catherine's posse surrounded them, a wall of authority that promised safety for the first time in days. Lena found herself relaxing in small increments, muscles she hadn't realized were locked tight, finally beginning to loosen. They reached Silver City as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The town was bigger than anywhere Lena had been in years. Maybe 3,000 people with real streets and proper buildings and the kind of infrastructure that suggested civilization still existed somewhere in the territories. Catherine led them straight to the courthouse, a substantial building of adobe and timber that dominated the town square. Judge Abernathy was waiting on the steps, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened while Catherine gave her report, occasionally glancing at Silas and Lena with an expression that suggested he was taking their measure. When Catherine finished, Abernathy gestured for them to follow him inside. They climbed stairs to his chambers, a book-lined room that smelled of leather and tobacco and justice, if justice had a smell. "Sit," Abernathy said, not unkindly, "and tell me everything from the beginning." So they did. Lena spoke first, telling the story of her accusation, her ordeal tied to that post, and Silas's rescue. Then Silas picked up the narrative, explaining about Pete Hartley and the lockbox and the desperate race to reach Silver City. They took turns, their words weaving together into a complete picture of injustice and defiance and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Abernathy listened without interruption, making occasional notes, his face giving nothing away. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers silent for a long moment. "What you're describing is actionable," he said finally. "False accusation, cruel punishment, horse theft, and by extension, conspiracy to commit fraud. Combined with Deputy Webb's investigation, I have grounds to issue a warrant for Eldon Grady's arrest." He paused. "But you need to understand something. Men like Grady don't go down easy. Even with all this evidence, the legal process will be long and difficult. He'll hire expensive lawyers. He'll call in favors. He'll make your lives hell through every legal and extra-legal means at his disposal." "We understand," Lena said. "Do you? Because right now you're running on adrenaline and righteous anger. But this fight could take months or years. You willing to see it through?" Lena thought about her father, about all the years she'd spent running from one town to the next, never staying long enough to build something real. Thought about the weight she'd carried since his death, the shame of accusation that had followed her like a shadow. And she thought about the last 3 days, about everything she and Silas had risked to get here. "Yes?" she said firmly. "I'm willing." Abernathy turned to Silas. "And you're not just a witness here. You're an accomplice to breaking and entering, possibly theft, depending on how aggressive Grady's lawyers get. You could face charges yourself. Then I'll face them. But I'm seeing this through, no matter how long it takes or what it costs." Abernathy smiled, then a small expression, but genuine. "Good. Because I'm going to need both of you to testify probably multiple times. And I'm going to need you to stay in Silver City where I can protect you until this matter is resolved." He pulled out paper and began writing. "I'm issuing the warrant tonight. Deputy Webb, I want you to take 12 men and bring Eldon Grady in for arraignment, peacefully if possible, but by force if necessary." Catherine nodded. "It'll be my pleasure, Your Honor." As she left to organize the arrest, Abernathy turned his attention back to Silas and Lena. "The territorial government will provide you with lodging and a small stipend while this matter is pending. It's not much, but it'll keep you fed and housed. And Miss Whitmore, I want it on record that as of this moment, all charges against you are formally dismissed. You're innocent in the eyes of the law, and I'll be filing paperwork to make sure that's documented in every jurisdiction that matters." Lena felt tears burning behind her eyes. After everything, the humiliation, the pain, the desperate flight across hostile territory. Those words hit her like a physical blow. Innocent, vindicated, free. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Eldon's behind bars where he belongs." Abernathy stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Now, go get cleaned up, get some rest, and try not to die before the trial. I'd hate to lose my star witnesses to something stupid like exhaustion." They left the courthouse as full darkness settled over Silver City. Lena felt lightheaded, almost giddy with relief and residual fear. They'd made it. Against all odds, against overwhelming opposition, they'd actually made it. Silas walked beside her in silence, his face unreadable. As they crossed the square toward the boarding house Abernathy had directed them to, Lena finally asked the question that had been building since they'd entered the judge's chambers. "How do you feel?" Silas stopped walking, looking up at the stars that were beginning to emerge overhead. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost wondering. I feel like maybe I didn't waste the last 5 years after all. Like maybe there's still time to be the man I used to be before everything went wrong. He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. Thank you for pushing me, for not letting me quit, for making me remember why I used to care about this kind of thing. You saved me first. This is just me returning the favor. Is it because it feels like something more than that? Lena reached out and took his hand, feeling the scars on his palm, the strength that remained despite everything trying to break him. Then maybe it is. Maybe we saved each other. And maybe that's how it's supposed to work, not one person rescuing another, but two broken people helping each other become whole again. They stood there in the darkness, hands joined, two survivors of different storms who'd found shelter in each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Eldon's arrest, the legal battles ahead, the slow work of building lives that weren't defined by trauma and flight. But tonight, for this moment, they were alive and vindicated and together. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The boarding house was a modest two-story structure run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who asked no questions and offered clean sheets which felt like luxury after days of sleeping rough. Lena was shown to a small room on the second floor with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the street. The simplicity of it made her throat tight with gratitude. She washed as best she could with the basin of warm water Mrs. Chen brought up, scrubbing away layers of dust and dried sweat and fear. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Hollow-eyed, bruised with bandages still wrapped around her wrists. But there was something else there too, something new, a hardness, a strength that hadn't existed before she'd been tied to that post. She'd survived. More than that, she'd fought back. A soft knock at her door made her turn. Silas stood in the hallway, cleaned up himself, wearing a fresh shirt that Mrs. Chen must have found for him. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just less haunted. "Just wanted to make sure you were settled," he said. "Come in, please." He entered cautiously, as if unsure of his welcome in this small space. Lena gestured to the single chair and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, the two of them alone, in a room with a closed door, the day's dangers finally behind them. "I can't quite believe we made it," she said. "Neither can I. Kept waiting for the other boot to drop, for something to go wrong at the last second." Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But here we are, alive, vindicated. Everything we fought for. Everything we fought for so far. Abernathy was right, this isn't over. Eldon's arrest is just the beginning." "I know, but for tonight, can we just pretend it is? Can we just sit here and breathe and not think about tomorrow's battles?" Lena smiled. "Yeah, we can do that." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people have been through hell together and come out the other side. Outside, Silver City was settling into its evening rhythms, voices in the street, a piano playing somewhere, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. It felt impossibly distant from where they'd been just hours ago. "Tell me something," Lena said after a while. "When this is really over, when Eldon's convicted and we're free to go wherever we want, where will you go? What will you do?" Silas was quiet, considering. "Honestly, I don't know. Haven't thought beyond survival in so long that making actual plans feels foreign. What about you?" "I want to go back to Dust Hollow." He looked at her sharply. "Why, there's nothing there but bad memories. There's land, open country, the kind of place where someone could build something if they were brave enough or stubborn enough." She met his eyes. "My father wanted to own a ranch someday, small place just enough to support himself and me. He never got that chance, but maybe I could. Maybe I could take what I've learned, take whatever money I can save, and actually build something that lasts. Something with my name on it that isn't connected to shame or accusation. That's a big dream. I've learned to dream big. Helps balance out the nightmares." Silas smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his face. You'd be good at it, running a ranch. You've got the steel for it and the stubbornness. Hell, you jumped a ravine on a horse you'd known for less than a day. That's either courage or insanity, and both are useful in ranching. What about you? Would you help me stay on as foreman or partner, or just someone who knows which end of a cow is which? She asked it lightly, but her heart hammered, waiting for his answer. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched emotions play across his face. Surprise, consideration, fear, and something that might have been hope. You're asking me to build a life with you. I'm asking if you want to. No pressure, no expectations. But Silas, we work well together. We've proven that. And I think we could build something good if we had the chance. Something neither of us could build alone. I'm not easy to live with. Got habits I'd need to break, demons I'm still fighting. And I'm twice your age, which makes this whole thing complicated in ways neither of us might have thought through. You're 25 years older, not twice my age. And I don't care about complicated. Complicated beats lonely. Complicated beats running from town to town with nothing to show for it but calluses and regret. She stood and moved to stand in front of him, close enough to touch, but not touching yet. I'm not asking you to marry me or make promises you can't keep. I'm just asking if you'd consider staying, building something together, seeing where this goes when we're not running for our lives. Silas reached up and took her hand, the same gesture she'd made in the town square, but this time with more weight behind it. I don't deserve this. Don't deserve you or the chance you're offering. Good thing it's not about deserving. It's about choosing. So choose Silas. Choose to stop punishing yourself. Choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, there's still good things ahead if you're willing to reach for them. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, until she was standing between his knees, his hands on her waist, her hands on his shoulders. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air close enough to feel each other's heartbeats. All right, he said quietly. All right, I'll stay. I'll help you build your ranch and see where this goes. But Lena, if I start dragging you down, if the weight I carry starts crushing you too, you promise me you'll walk away. Promise me you won't sacrifice yourself trying to save someone who might not be savable. I promise. But only if you promise to actually try. Try to forgive yourself. Try to believe you're worth something. Try to build a life instead of just surviving one. Deal. She bent down and kissed him. Then a gentle press of lips that tasted like new beginnings and hard-won hope. He responded carefully, as if afraid she might break or disappear if he held on too tight. But she was stronger than he thought strong enough to carry them both until he remembered how to carry himself. When they pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them felt electric with possibility. We should probably get some sleep, Silas said, though he made no move to leave. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. It is, but tonight's ours. He stood slowly and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Thank you for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself. Thank you for pulling me off that post, for remembering mercy when it would have been easier to keep riding. I don't think anything about you has been easy, Lena Whitmore, but I think that's the point. He left, then closing the door softly behind him, and Lena was alone with her thoughts and the echo of his touch on her skin. She lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in years allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by running or surviving or just getting through another day. A ranch with her name on it, land that belonged to her, horses in the corral and cattle on the range, and a man who understood trauma standing beside her. It seemed impossible, like wishing on stars and expecting them to answer. But then again, 5 days ago she'd been tied to a fence post waiting to die, and now she was vindicated and free with a judge on her side. If that was possible, maybe anything was. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, and her dreams were full of wide-open spaces and the sound of hammers building something new. The next morning arrived with harsh reality. Catherine Webb knocked on Lena's door at dawn, her face grim despite the early hour. We've got a problem. Eldon's gone. Lena dressed quickly and followed Catherine downstairs where Silas was already waiting, still pulling on his boots. Catherine's posse stood in the street. Horses ready, clearly prepared to ride. What do you mean gone? Silas asked. I mean, when we got to his ranch last night to serve the warrant, the house was empty. Staff said he left yesterday afternoon with 4 of his best men, didn't say where he was going. Took enough supplies for a long trip. Catherine's expression was thunderous. Someone tipped him off. Probably saw our posse riding out and put 2 and 2 together. Or he's been watching Silver City, saw us arrive, and decided discretion was the better part of valor, Silas said. Eldon's not stupid. He knows when the game's up. So what now? Lena asked. He just disappears and faces no consequences. Not if I have anything to say about it. Catherine gestured to her men. I'm taking a posse and going after him. Judge Abernathy's issued a territory-wide warrant, and I've wired ahead to every town and marshal station between here and Mexico. Eldon Grady's not going to vanish into the desert. I'll find him. We're coming with you, Silas said immediately. No, you're not. Your witness is not law enforcement, and I need you alive to testify when we do bring him in. Catherine's tone brooked no argument. You've done your part. Let me do mine. But, Silas, Catherine softened slightly, I know you want to see this through to the end. I understand that impulse. But the best thing you can do right now is stay here, stay safe, and let the law work. Trust me to do my job. Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but Lena put a hand on his arm, shaking her head slightly. Catherine was right. They'd pushed their luck as far as it would go. Pushing farther might get them killed, or worse, might compromise the legal case they'd built. All right, Silas said grudgingly. But you find him, you send word immediately, and if you need us, we'll come running. Understood. Catherine mounted her horse, her posse falling into formation around her. Stay out of trouble, and try not to die before I get back. I hate paperwork. They rode out in a thunder of hooves, leaving Silas and Lena standing in the street as the sun climbed higher. The day suddenly felt too long, too empty, too full of waiting. She'll catch him, Lena said, trying to convince herself as much as Silas. Maybe, or maybe Eldon's got resources we don't know about. Hideouts, friends, ways to disappear that would take months to track. Silas turned and started walking, his frustration evident in every line of his body. I hate this. Hate sitting here useless while someone else finishes what we started. We're not useless. We're staying alive and ready to testify. That matters. Does it? Because right now it feels like we did all that work, risked everything, and Eldon still gets away. They walked through Silver City, neither with any particular destination, just moving because staying still felt impossible. The town was waking up around them, shops opening, people going about their business, the ordinary machinery of civilization grinding forward, oblivious to their drama. They ended up at a small church on the edge of town, its whitewashed walls bright in the morning sun. The door stood open in invitation, and after a moment's hesitation, Lena walked inside. The interior was cool and dim wooden pews arranged in neat rows facing a simple altar. It smelled of candle wax and old wood, and the accumulated prayers of people seeking comfort. Lena hadn't been in a church since her father's funeral, but something about this space called to her. She sat in the back pew, and Silas sat beside her, both of them staring at the altar without speaking. Minutes passed in silence. Do you believe in God? Lena asked finally. I don't know. Used to back when I was young and the world made sense. Then I saw too much cruelty, too much suffering, and I couldn't reconcile the idea of a loving God with the reality I was living. Silas leaned back, looking up at the ceiling. But lately I've been wondering, because we shouldn't have made it, Lena. By any rational calculation, we should be dead 3 times over. But here we are. So either we're incredibly lucky, or something's been watching out for us. Martha would say God works through people, that he doesn't swoop down and fix things himself, but he puts the right people in the right places at the right times. Lena thought about all the unlikely moments that had saved them Catherine being undercover at the ranch. Martha and James giving them a horse, the ravine jump that should have killed them, but didn't. Maybe that's what faith is. Not believing in miracles, but believing that good people still exist, and sometimes they show up when you need them most. If that's faith, then I've got more of it than I thought. They sat there for another hour, finding peace in the quiet, in the simple act of being alive and together. When they finally left, the day felt less heavy, more bearable. They returned to the boarding house where Mrs. Chen fed them a substantial breakfast and asked no questions about why they looked like they'd been dragged behind horses for miles. The afternoon was harder. Without action to focus on, without danger to react to, they were left with nothing but their thoughts and the slow passage of time. Lena tried to rest but couldn't settle. Silas paced like a caged animal, his restlessness filling the entire boarding house. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward evening, he stopped in front of Lena's room and knocked. When she opened the door, he looked determined in a way that made her nervous. "Come with me. I want to show you something." He led her out of town following a path that climbed into the hills overlooking Silver City. The walk took 20 minutes, and by the time they reached their destination, Lena was breathing hard from the exertion. But the view was worth it. They stood on a ridge that offered a panoramic vista of the surrounding territory mountains, in the distance valleys spreading out below the vast open country that defined the West. And there may be 5 miles to the south, a section of land that looked perfect for ranching water access. Good grazing, protected from the worst weather by the lay of the hills. "That's what you want, isn't it?" Silas said quietly. "Land like that. A place to build something. It's beautiful." "It's for sale. Or it was last time I rode through here. Owner died, heirs live back east and want nothing to do with it. Judge Abernathy would know how to contact them." He turned to face her. "I've got money saved. Not a fortune, but enough to make a down payment if the price is reasonable. We could buy it, Lena. Could start building that ranch you dreamed about." "Silas, I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other outside of extreme circumstances. But I also know that I haven't felt this alive, this purposeful in 5 years. And I don't want to go back to just existing. I want to build something. With you. If you'll have me." Lena stared at the land below, seeing not just what it was, but what it could be. A house, barns, corrals, fields, a life built from nothing created through will and work, and the stubborn refusal to let trauma define them. "On one condition," she said. "What's that? We name it the Whitmore Boone Ranch, equal partners, equal names. None of this silent partner nonsense where I do all the work and you pretend you're just helping." Silas smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "Deal. Though Whitmore Boone's a mouthful, people are going to shorten it. Let them. As long as both our names are on the deed and the brand, they can call it whatever they want." They shook hands on it, a formal gesture that felt fitting for the weight of what they were committing to. Then Silas pulled her into a hug, and they stood there on that ridge watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors. Two people who'd found each other in the worst possible way and decided to make something good from it anyway. The moment was shattered by the sound of gunfire from the direction of town. They ran back down the path, hearts pounding, fear replacing the peace they'd just found. As they burst back onto Silver City's main street, chaos greeted them. People were running for cover, shouting about men with guns. And there in the middle of the street was Eldon Grady. He'd come back. But he hadn't come to surrender. He'd come for revenge, and he'd brought his remaining men with him, maybe 10 or 12, all armed, all looking for blood. Buildings bore fresh bullet holes, and at least one person lay wounded in the street, being dragged to safety by others. Silas pulled Lena behind a water trough, both of them scrambling for their weapons. "He's lost his mind. This is suicide. He knows he's finished. The law's after him, his ranch is forfeit, his reputation destroyed. This is a man with nothing left to lose." Lena checked her pistol, noting with sick certainty that she had maybe 8 shots. Not nearly enough if this turned into a prolonged fight. Eldon's voice boomed across the street, amplified by rage and desperation. "Silas Boone Lena Whitmore, I know you're here. Come out and face me like you had the courage to face me on my own land." "He's trying to draw us out," Silas said. "Make us targets. We can't just hide while he terrorizes the whole town." "No, but we can be smart about it. Wait for an opening, take him down fast before more people get hurt." But fate had other plans. One of Eldon's men spotted them behind the trough and opened fire. Bullets punched through wood and sent water spraying. Silas and Lena rolled in opposite directions, both coming up shooting. The street erupted into warfare. Townspeople who'd armed themselves joined the fight, turning what should have been a one-sided slaughter into a genuine battle. Eldon's men found themselves taking fire from multiple directions, their advantage of surprise and numbers eroding quickly. Lena moved between buildings, trying to get a clear shot at Eldon himself. She saw him across the street, massive and furious, firing at anything that moved. She aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, hitting the wall behind him. He turned and saw her, and something like satisfaction crossed his face. "There you are, you thieving little bitch. Time to finish what I started at that fence post." He started toward her, and Lena realized with sickening clarity that she'd made a tactical error. She was exposed, separated from Silas, with Eldon Grady bearing down on her like an avalanche. She fired again, hitting him in the shoulder, but not stopping him. Then Silas was there, putting himself between Lena and Eldon, rifle raised. "That's far enough." Eldon laughed, a terrible sound, full of pain and madness. "You gonna shoot me, Silas?" "Finally grow the spine to put down a rabid dog." "If I have to, but I'm giving you one chance to surrender. Throw down your weapon, and this ends without anyone else dying." No, I don't think so. I think I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to kill her, and then I'm going to burn this whole goddamn town down around anyone who thought they could defy me." He raised his gun, aiming at Silas's chest, and Lena shot him. Not in the shoulder this time, but center mass, the way Silas had taught her during one of their rest stops. The bullet caught Eldon in the chest, spinning him sideways. He looked down at the wound, surprised, then looked up at Lena with something like respect. "Well," he said, voice already fading, "I'll be damned. You got more spine than your daddy after all." He collapsed, hitting the street hard enough to raise dust. His men, seeing their leader fall, lost whatever fight remained in them. Those who could run did. Those who couldn't surrendered to the angry townspeople who'd armed themselves. It was over in minutes, the sudden violence giving way to equally sudden silence. Lena stood frozen, gun still raised, staring at what she'd done. She'd killed a man, ended a life with her own hand. The weight of it hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her knees start to buckle. Silas caught her, supporting her weight, gently taking the gun from her shaking hand. "Easy. I've got you. You did what you had to do." "I killed him." "You saved my life. Probably saved a lot of lives." Eldon wasn't going to stop, wasn't going to surrender. "You did the right thing, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." She turned her face into his chest, breathing in the smell of him, trying to anchor herself to something solid while the world spun around her. "I didn't mean to. I mean, I did, but I didn't think—" "I know. Nobody ever does. But Lena, listen to me." He pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands on her shoulders. "You're going to have nightmares about this. Going to replay it in your head 1,000 times. But you need to remember that you gave him a chance to surrender. Multiple chances. He chose violence, and you responded with justified force. That's not murder. That's survival." Judge Abernathy appeared then, having emerged from his courthouse where he'd taken shelter during the shooting. He surveyed the scene with grim efficiency, taking in the bodies, the wounded, the terrified townspeople slowly coming out of hiding. "Someone get Doc Morrison," he called. "And someone else find Deputy Webb, tell her she can stop searching because her quarry's here." His eyes found Lena and Silas. "You two all right?" "We're alive," Silas said. "That's something." Abernathy approached Eldon's body, checking for a pulse and finding none. "Well, this simplifies my legal proceedings considerably. Not the outcome I wanted, but probably the one Eldon chose when he rode back here with violence in mind." He looked up at Lena. "You shot him?" "Yes, sir." "At what range?" "Maybe 15 feet. He was threatening Silas, was going to kill him." "Any witnesses to that?" Several townspeople spoke up, confirming Lena's account. Abernathy nodded, making mental notes. "Clear case of justified defense of another. No charges will be filed. But Miss Whitmore, I'm going to need a full statement for the record." "I understand." Catherine Webb arrived an hour later, riding hard with her posse, only to find the town cleaning up from a battle, and Eldon Grady laid out in the undertaker's with a sheet over his face. Her expression when she realized what she'd missed was somewhere between relieved and furious. "I can't leave you two alone for a day without you starting a war," she said, though there was no real anger in it. "We didn't start it," Lena said, "but we finished it." The rest of the day was consumed by statements and paperwork, and the slow process of documenting what had happened. Lena told her story so many times the words started to lose meaning, becoming just sounds she repeated by rote. But through it all, Silas stayed by her side, a steady presence that kept her grounded. As night fell and Silver City began the process of recovery, Abernathy called them both back to his chambers one final time. The charges against Miss Whitmore were already dismissed, but now it's official in public. Every newspaper in the territory is going to carry the story falsely accused woman vindicated kills corrupt rancher in self-defense. You're going to be famous, Miss Whitmore, or infamous depending on who's writing the story. I don't want to be famous. I just want to build my ranch and live my life. Then I suggest you do exactly that. But do it knowing that you've struck a blow for justice that's going to echo through this territory for years. Other Eldon Gradys out there are going to think twice before they abuse their power quite so openly. He turned to Silas. And you. Former marshal comes out of retirement to save an innocent woman and bring down a criminal. That's the kind of story people need. Reminds them that good men still exist. I'm not a good man, Your Honor. Just one trying to be better than I was. That's the definition of good son. None of us start there. We all work toward it. Abernathy pulled out 2 documents and slid them across his desk. These are deeds to the property you asked about, the land south of here. The heirs were happy to sell, and I negotiated a price that shouldn't bankrupt you. Consider it payment for services rendered, though officially, I'm just facilitating a real estate transaction. Lena picked up one of the deeds, seeing her name written there, Lena May Whitmore, co-owner of 320 acres of prime rangeland. Next to her name was Silas's. Equal partners, just like she'd insisted. Thank you, she whispered, emotion making her voice thick. Don't thank me. Thank yourselves for having the courage to stand up when it would have been easier to stay down. Now get out of my office and go build something worth building. I've got enough paperwork here to keep me busy for a month. They left the courthouse for what felt like the last time stepping out into a night full of stars and possibility. The street was quiet now, damage being repaired, wounded being tended, life slowly returning to normal. So, Silas said, we're ranchers now, landowners, respectable members of society. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely. But I figure if we survived the last week, we can probably survive anything. They walked back to the boarding house slowly, neither wanting to rush both, needing time to process everything that had happened. At her door, Lena paused, turning to face Silas. I know I shot him, she said quietly. No, I ended his life. And I know I'm going to carry that for the rest of mine. But Silas, I don't regret it. Is that wrong? No, it's human. Eldon made his choices, and they led him to that street with a gun in his hand, threatening innocent people. You made yours, and they led you to protect someone you care about. Those are different things. Do you regret any of it? Pulling me off that post, helping me fight Eldon, risking everything. Silas reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture tender and intimate. Not for 1 second. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to care, a reason to keep going. I'll never regret that. She kissed him. Then not the gentle press of lips from the night before, but something deeper, more urgent, born of survival and relief, and the knowledge that they'd both come too close to death not to celebrate being alive. He responded with equal intensity, hands tangling in her hair, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lena smiled. Come inside. Stay with me tonight. Not because I'm scared or need protecting, but because I want you here. Want to fall asleep knowing you're close. You sure? I'm sure. They spent that night talking more than sleeping, lying together in the narrow bed, sharing stories and dreams and plans for the ranch they'd build together. Lena told him about her mother, the woman she'd never known, and her father's grief that had shaped so much of her childhood. Silas told her about the girl in Colorado finally giving voice to the trauma he'd carried alone for so long. They cried together, laughed together, and somewhere in the early hours of morning fell asleep, tangled in each other's arms, 2 broken people who'd found wholeness in the most unexpected way. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. The trial for Eldon's surviving men proceeded quickly, most of them accepting plea bargains rather than face full prosecution. Pete Hartley was found in Mexico and extradited back to face charges, his lockbox evidence ensuring his conviction. Other ranchers who'd suffered under Eldon's intimidation began coming forward with their own stories, and slowly, painfully, justice worked its way through the system. Lena and Silas spent their days on their new land planning and building and learning to be partners in both business and life. They hired hands to help with the heavy work, young men looking for honest employment, a few former ranch workers from Eldon's spread who'd had no part in his crimes. Martha and James visited, bringing supplies and advice in their blessing. Catherine Webb stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on witnesses, but really Lena suspected because she'd become something like a friend. She'd left undercover work behind, taking a position as deputy marshal for the region, and her presence meant that corruption would have a harder time taking root again. 3 months after that night in Silver City, the Whitmore Boone Ranch officially opened for business. It wasn't much yet, a small house they'd built themselves, 2 barns, a dozen head of cattle, and dreams bigger than their resources. But it was theirs, built with their hands and paid for with their courage. They held a small celebration to mark the occasion, inviting everyone who'd helped them along the way. Judge Abernathy came, as did Catherine and her husband. Martha and James brought a hand-carved sign that read Whitmore Boone Ranch in letters painted gold. Tom Jessup even showed up walking with a cane from his leg wound to apologize in person for not standing up to Eldon sooner. As the sun set and their guests departed, Lena and Silas stood on the porch of their new house looking out over land that belonged to them. The same land where months ago they'd stood on a ridge and dared to imagine this future. "We did it," Lena said softly. "Actually did it." "We did," Silas agreed, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Built something good from something terrible. Not many people can say that. What do you think my father would say if he could see this?" "I think he'd say he was proud of you. Proud that you didn't let false accusation define you, that you fought back, that you built the life he always wanted but never got to have." Silas paused. "And I think he'd say thank you for giving a broken-down ex-marshal a reason to believe in redemption again." Lena leaned into him, feeling safe and anchored and home in a way she'd never felt before. "Do you still wake up thinking about that girl, about the mistake you made?" "Sometimes, but now when I do, I also remember that mistakes don't have to be the end of the story, that there's always another chapter if you're brave enough to write it." In the distance, cattle lowed softly. A nightbird called. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. And 2 people who'd met under the worst circumstances stood together watching stars emerge, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges and joys in equal measure. But they'd face it together as partners, as friends, as 2 souls who'd found in each other what they hadn't known. They were searching for proof that even in the hardest country, with the longest odds, mercy and justice and love could still take root. The desert hadn't crushed them. The cruelty they'd faced hadn't broken them. Instead, they'd taken fire and pain and transformed it into something beautiful. A home, a ranch, a future. And that, Lena thought, as Silas pressed a kiss to the top of her head, was the true heartbeat of the West. Not the violence or the hardship that everyone remembered, but the quiet moments when broken people chose to rebuild. When mercy was given not once, but twice. When the old lawman and the accused woman decided that their story didn't have to end in tragedy. Years later, when people asked about the Whitmore Boone Ranch and how it came to be, Lena would smile and say, "It started with 3 words spoken under a burning sun: stop looking, take it off." Words that had been a plea for mercy. And mercy, it turned out, was just another word for the beginning of everything good. The fire that had tested them became the forge that made them stronger. And they lived in the warmth of it for all their days, grateful for second chances and each other, building a legacy that would outlast them both. A testament to what happens when courage meets compassion, when justice meets mercy, and when 2 people decide that the best revenge against cruelty is to create something beautiful in spite of it. The ranch thrived. The land gave back what they poured into it. And every evening, as the sun painted the sky in colors that defied description, Lena and Silas would stand on that porch and remember the journey that brought them there, the fire, the fear, the desperate race for vindication. And they would hold each other close, 2 survivors who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating enemies, but about refusing to let trauma have the final word. They'd refused, they'd fought, they'd won. And in winning, they discovered that the best way to honor the past was to build a future worthy of the struggle. The Whitmore Boone Ranch stood as proof that mercy matters, that justice is worth fighting for, and that love, when it comes from shared survival and mutual respect, can heal wounds that seem permanent. Under the vast western sky, two people had found each other and decided to stay. And that decision, more than any other, made all the difference.